Mr. Ward.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Rees-Williams, just to recap where we had got to yesterday afternoon, you had been driven to the use of Anglo-Saxon when you learned of the VIP lane, and you gave evidence to the effect that the involvement of ministers, or what you describe as ministerial pressure, proved to be, to some degree, a distraction. Do you recall?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think...
Just two questions arising out of that. Can I be clear, or could the inquiry be clear, as to what it is you mean when you say ministerial pressure?
Thank you. Yes, I think that's important. I think what I suggested, what I'd say again today, ministers, or more particularly their offices, because ministers rarely do this themselves, their offices chasing for an update is one thing, annoying, gets in the way, causes noise, wastes people's time. That is very different from how some people use the phrase pressure, meaning a minister putting pressure on someone to take a particular order and progress it and take it to contract for non-logical reasons.
Yes, so you made that distinction yesterday, but your numerous references within your written evidence to ministerial pressure I take to mean that there were instances in which the contact that was made did result in pressure coming to bear on those who were responsible for making decisions in relation to procurement. Is that right?
I don't think that translated into pressure on take this offer over that offer.
Well, no, you're answering a question that I'm not putting to you. You've referred to ministerial pressure. You've told us that there are different grades or ranges of intervention from ministers or their offices, but whichever they are, it must mean that they resulted in pressure. You use the phrase in your evidence.
Everyone was under enormous pressure to buy as much PPE or ventilators or whatever it was, laptops for schools or whatever the subject was, because of the nature of the crisis.
But Mr. Rees-Williams, that's not ministerial pressure. We subdivided the forms of pressure. First and foremost is the pressure that results from the urgent need to provide those on the front line with vital PPE. Mm-hmm. We are not now discussing that. Ministerial pressure came through periodic interventions in the procurement decision-making process. That's right, isn't it?
Well, I wasn't in the teams that actually made decisions, apart from the ventilator team, which I think we'll come to later. So I'm not aware of ministers directly talking to the people in the cells.
All right.
But there was overarching pressure the whole time. Civil service go faster.
We'll hear from some of those individuals who were in those positions tomorrow, and perhaps I'll leave those questions then for them. But so far as distraction is concerned, I just want to put up on display, if I may, INQ 000339149 and page 4 of it. Apparently, this is just so that we situate ourselves within the document. It's a PMO, Prime Minister's Office update of the 16th of April 2020. And we can see, can't we, in the right-hand column, key points, if you can find your way in the third section, 1, 2, 3, 4 down. VIP escalation is obstructing progress of more viable opportunities for larger scalable manufacturers. Is that what you were referring to yesterday when you gave evidence to the effect that ministerial intervention was proving to be a distraction?
So it's not one of my documents and
No.
not a meeting I was at. So,
but it's a reference to something that I'm asking you.
Yeah. So that sort of escalation, that noise generation, distracts people answering questions. They're the elected representatives, so you have to answer their questions. But if it takes time away from the job at hand, that's possibly not best use of their time. And I think that's probably what the writer was talking about there.
You either answer their questions or you set up a system that discourages the asking of those questions or that automates responses, or that you avoid the introduction of a system at all that invites that form of intervention. That's right, isn't it?
That would be the ideal world, but ministers are elected, they're the elected members of Parliament, and I think I've never been a minister, but had someone sent in an offer that was brilliant, that their office pushed on to the teams, and for some reason the teams had overlooked it, hadn't done anything with it, and later it had turned out that that was the life-saving offer that would have saved hundreds of people, and they'd done nothing. Their office wouldn't let them get into that position. Their office would be chasing those things. So I agree with you. In the ideal world, and I agree with what Professor Sanchez-Grell said yesterday, in the ideal world, you just say, don't worry, we're working on it. But that's not a response that meets with much favour met with much favour with ministers. And I can see why, because they were on the telly every night having to answer for why there was no PPE in hospitals, why there was no ventilators, why there was no this, that, and the other. So, yes, but I think that's unrealistic.
Mr. Rhys-Williams, you were watching the telly most nights and you were aware of criticism that was raised in relation to the introduction of the VIP lane. And it's for that reason that you commissioned, or you more accurately, as you pointed out yesterday, you asked for the commissioning of 2 GIAA reports, isn't it?
As well as the ones I did myself, yes.
As well as the one that you did. Now, I'm not going to ask you about pricing because we're going to deal with pricing with a later witness. I am relatively briefly going to ask you about the 2 GIAA reports now, if I may. The first was commissioned in August 2020, yes?
Yes.
And it was to look into allegations of cronyism surrounding the VIP lane, yeah?
Yes.
It led to
and proper process, whether we were following proper process.
Yes, I've put those together. Yeah. That led to the Phase 1 report, which was published in October of 2021, the 1st of October 2021. So fairly swiftly produced.
It would have been better if it had been swifter, but yes.
It was able to be as swift as it was because it looked at a relatively limited number of specific contracts.
Yes, I asked the GIA to pick the 6 that they felt were the most poisonous and worthy of investigation, and I didn't choose the 6. I don't believe that they did.
6 is quite the 6 most poisonous ones, as you put it, is a relatively small sample size, isn't it? To draw general conclusions about the BIP lane.
They did another 6 later. I would have rather it was a larger sample, but in GIA 2, they did look for pricing against the whole data set of hundreds of contracts, and that's what's in those pricing graphs.
Let's have a look at some of the GIA Phase 1 report. It's INQ 000478823. If I could have that displayed, please. And we want within it the summary of the findings. The VIP channel. It's page 7 of 17. Do you see sort of a little bit further than halfway down the page there? One of the new procedures introduced was to have a high priority mailbox serviced by a dedicated team, which would review offers of PPE from a reliable source. Yeah? And then what follows are these words. Examples of sources included senior politicians, ministers, senior executives of government organisations and MPs. There's a confusion there, isn't there? Because those individuals, senior politicians, ministers, senior executives, of government organisations are not the source, they are the referrers, aren't they?
Yeah, it depends what the audit team meant by the word source. Do they mean the referral, or do they mean the company behind the...
Well, it must be to review offers of PPE from a reliable source. Examples of sources, just using the language as it is commonly used, you wouldn't say that because a minister has referred in a company, that minister is the source of PPE, would you? You'd say that that minister is a referrer.
This is not my document, so yes.
Well, it's not your document, but it's one that you refer to extensively in your evidence that you asked that be commissioned, and that gave you the comfort that the VIP lane was unproblematic, yes?
Yes, I'm also, if you look at in the bold above, the phase 1 summary of findings, controls being designed and established that were proportionate to the need. So
you assumed, didn't you, Mr. Rees-Williams, that because an offer had come in via a particular referrer, that offer was inherently more credible or more solid than offers that had come in by other means?
No. I didn't write that report. So each team, and there are varieties of opportunity teams, 7 or 8, and the VIP team, they each triaged all the offers they got. So where we talk about, there's been some comment about ministers triaging. I don't believe that was the case. Some of the offers might have been, they might have winnowed out some of the obviously bogus ones, but the triaging was done by the officials. So they just dealt with their inbox. I wasn't in the team, so you'll get more on this from Max and Chris.
Mr. Rees-Williams, it's right that you didn't write the report, but you did write your witness statement, INQ 000536362, and you wrote within it paragraph 75. Which is page 25, I beg your pardon. While it's being located, I'll just read back to you your own words from the what I thought was, and I think is paragraph 75 of this statement. It might reasonably be anticipated that the kind of offers which had been escalated to ministers and senior officials were coming from businesses with serious offers, and that the referrers recognised them as such before sending them on. Do you recall those words in your statement?
Yes, but they're still triaged by the officials.
They're triaged after they've gone in to the HPL.
So what I intended to mean by that is that, so it might be anticipated, so it's more likely that businesses are going to contact ministers than, I think if you have to look at the nature of the people in the non-high priority lane, who those offers were from. A lot of those were from individuals. Again, my colleagues can talk more to the detail of that. So I think it's more likely that it was businesses that had got in touch with ministers, and therefore more likely that they were able to do with it. But that wasn't a decision stage. Most ministers, most offices just shuffled the referral to whoever they thought was the most appropriate person.
But Mr. Rees-Williams, that is, if I may say so, an answer to my earlier question. You did make the assumption, and you've now given the reasons you made that assumption, that offers that came in through the, I can see it's on the screen now, at the bottom of 75, it might reasonably be anticipated that the kind of offers which had been escalated to ministers and senior officials were coming from businesses with serious offers, and that the referrers recognised them as such before sending them on. That is what you assumed. And we're going to have a look at it in a moment, whether there is a basis for assuming it. You started a moment ago to give the reasons you assumed it, but it is what you assumed, isn't it?
Yes, but I'm not quite clear what you...
It's a very simple question, if I may say so, Mr. Rhys-Williams. There was an assumption on your part that offers coming in via the HPL were inherently more credible or more solid or more promising than those that had come in by other means. A moment ago, you started to give the reasons why you had made that assumption, but it was an assumption that you made, wasn't it?
No, I'm saying here it's coming from businesses. It's perfectly possible that the business came up with non-useful offers. But the word here is, I think the key word is businesses.
Well, there were business offers.
I wasn't in the HPL team that then did the triaging when they actually looked at the detail of each of these offers. We've talked before about why it's inevitable that a group of people, a group of offerors, were likely to get in touch with ministers and MPs and people in the health service and health families that they knew. And I think those offerers were more likely to be businesses than they were citizens. That's, I think, all I'm trying to...
Well, once again, you're giving explanations for an assumption that you made. I'm asking for the answer first. You can then give whatever clarification or elaboration that you wish to afterwards. But for whatever reason, it may be because a disproportionate number of businesses came to minister referrers, for example, you did make an assumption that the offers that came in via the HPL were more promising, were more credible, were more solid than those on average that came in by other means, didn't you?
I think the sentence here refers to the stats above. So this is analysing the stats ex post, not ex ante.
All right, I'm going to move on, Mr. Rhys-Williams. Can we go back to the GIAA report? It's 000478823, and its findings, back to page 7. Just below the paragraph we were looking at, or two below, approximately 450 companies came through this high priority mailbox, of which 45 were awarded contracts, giving a conversion rate of 10%, yes?
Yep.
So conversion rate means the comparison of either offers made, or in fact here, it is suppliers to contracts secured.
Yes, and I think it's an important distinction to make. And I think yesterday Professor Sanchez-Grels made an error when he said that it was 90% of the offers were HPL. And I regret in your opening statement as well, you I fear, may have mixed up companies and offers, because here it's 450 companies, whereas on Monday you used 430 offers, and you compared offers in the non-HPL with companies in the HPL, and we talked about this offline.
Well,
I think this is an important distinction because lots of companies gave multiple offers.
They did, and I'm going to come on to this. Okay. I gave a figure in opening of 17, a conversion rate of 17 times rather than 10 times.
Yes, and I think that number is not quite right. Well, I think it's wrong by a factor of 3 or 4, because you took 450 companies in the HPL and 20-odd thousand offers in the non-HPL. So I suspect, though colleagues will have the actual data, there's more like 2,000 offers in the HPL, and therefore you should have compared 2,000. Anyway.
Do you reject this number, Mr. Rhys-Williams, the conversion rate of 10?
No, at the time this was written, I think it changed, by the time the pandemic had finished. So yes, 90% of HPL offers were rejected, 10% were successful.
All right, I'm going to come back to the 17 times conversion rate in a few moments,
Okay.
because I want you to have a full opportunity to look at the figures. In relation to GIAA report, due diligence decisions were not fully recorded, were they?
No, and we would all accept the paperwork was not as good as it should have been in peacetime.
That's right. That's a fair summary. And you say at paragraph 4.442 of your corporate statement, we can go to it if necessary, but it may not be necessary. As part of the due diligence, the directors of potential suppliers were checked by the markets and suppliers team using an HMRC tool that flagged whether they were politically exposed persons. The results of these checks, positive or negative, were recorded on the due diligence report, forwarded to the closing team. Do you recall that part of your evidence?
I can't find it, but I'm sure you're right.
This only runs checks on directors, doesn't it? It's a fairly narrow search.
Yes, probably.
With hindsight, do you think that the HMRC tool was too narrow a check on due diligence?
Well, I think it was the best probably that the team could find at the time. And I think there are very few tools that, a directorship is something that companies house record, and therefore HMRC data will pick up, and other data that the commercial function would pick up. Management below directors is rarely in a useful database.
You asked that another GIA report be commissioned, didn't you, that dealt more specifically with due diligence?
Well, I asked them to, when they did the first 6, and you make a good point earlier about sample size, but 6 is all they said they could do. I asked them to do another 6 because there was still plenty of noise, and I wanted to be as thorough as their resource would allow.
Did you likewise select the 6 most poisonous cases for the GIA Phase 2 report?
Perhaps poisonous is a loose word. I asked them just to pick the ones that they thought most concerned them, rather than me giving them a list. I don't believe I did that.
We understand from your evidence that 2 contracts were selected at random and 4 were requested for review. Is that right?
Yeah, but on which one? On
the Phase 2 report.
Phase 2. Possibly. Yeah. I mean, if that's what the evidence pack says.
In some cases, no due diligence had been carried out.
So I think you need, if that's what it says, then it's right. I think you need to separate what sort of due diligence we're talking about. Are we talking about financial due diligence, which did take us a week or 2 to set up, because we didn't have access to those. We talked about systems before, but we didn't have access to all those systems. So what then went forward to DHSC to decide whether they took the order or not would have been a pack with some financial due diligence in it, late increasingly as we went on, or without it. And then it was for them on a balance of risks point. This gets back to the red flags from the Transparency International from Mr. Bruce yesterday, for DH to decide balance of risk. Do we take that offer? We probably wouldn't in peacetime, but do we take it now?
Let's have a look at the relevant section of the second report to the Phase 2 report. It's INQ 000501951, page 7 of 50. Page 7 of 51. Our review found due diligence processes on a company's background and financials was documented, and due diligence was carried out before an application would go to the clearance board. However, where due diligence identified potential issues, in some cases limited documentation had been retained on defence share to evidence how the issues raised were resolved, or where documentation existed, it would take a significant amount of time to locate and assess. Also, we found some counterparties had due diligence done on them, but others had not. Therefore, Cabinet Office should consider being clear about what processes and checks. It's put in rather binary terms within the report, isn't it?
Yes, that's my point. Earlier, we weren't doing financial due diligence. Later, we were.
Okay, but 2 of the sample size here had none done at all.
If that's what the report says, then yes.
All right.
I'm not denying it would have been ideal to have had financial due diligence from day one, but we weren't able to set that up.
You also looked at dropout rate analysis, didn't you?
That's right, yes.
And you wanted to know what the funneling down was, HPL compared to non-HPL.
Yes, so this was, the first analysis I did was the pricing analysis, and then second, it occurred to me that we should look at to see were the two streams giving an unusual rate of dropout, by which, as you go through the different steps, my lady, was there a pinch point where suddenly all the low priority ones vanished, which might indicate a bias of some description?
I think the quickest way to understand the result of that analysis is to look at a graphic that you've included within your corporate statement. It's INQ 000497 031 and page 192. You're familiar with this graphic. It was put up on display during the opening.
Indeed.
And in broad terms, it shows that the funneling down is quicker, isn't it, on non-HPL offers at every stage?
Yes. When this was put in, I didn't create this chart. The one I worked on personally was split by category, which is more useful. This is an aggregation, so it may be, I don't know, it may be that some granularity is lost. But yes, what you see here is that the non-HPL ones failed the earlier phases quite quickly. So the initial sifts of, what size company, is this a large order? They fell out, as you would probably expect, from the nature of the people that were proposing them. There were lots of very small, but worthy, well-intentioned, but very small offers that would have failed or did fail in that initial sift, a volume thing, or maybe they were the wrong product. So, yes, that's not. This didn't surprise me.
And what you also should bear in mind, is this not right, Mr. Rhys-Williams, is that, and we'll see this in tomorrow's evidence, is that if that could just stay on the screen for a moment longer, is that in the HPL offers, you have periodic interventions from ministers or their offices, chasers, how is this offer progressing, and so on and so forth, whereas you wouldn't have that on the blue funnel at the top of the page, the non-HPLs. That's right, isn't it?
You'd have to talk to the team. I suspect some of the larger non-HPL offers, bear in mind, we spent almost exactly the same amount on non-HPL as we did HPL offers. So I suspect some of the larger ones, once they got known about, would have been chased. But yes.
Do I need
HPL?
I will talk to the team, of course, and others will too, in questioning tomorrow. But do I need to talk to the team, by which you mean Mr. Canduff, Mr. Hall, yes, to understand whether the interventions were as frequent outside of the HPL than they were within the HPL? Is that evidence that you can help us with?
The HPL was set up deliberately to handle ministerial office requests.
Of course.
So, yes, my assumption, therefore, is that most of the ministerial interest was in those offers. But there were some very large offers that came through the non-HPL normal, the other 8-stage things, and from China, which, as I say, when they were large and, I suspect, I do not know, Mrs. Lawson would know, Emily Lawson would know, those briefings to the Prime Minister, I suspect they gave examples of offers that they were looking at. So I think you're right in terms of where the balance was, but I can't say.
All right. Now, that's all I really wanted to ask you about the GIA reports phase 1 and 2, save for this. They were done several years ago. They were done, both of them, with small sample sizes.
Yep.
And they were done with other suboptimals, if I can put it in that way, in relation to due diligence. We've looked as an example. But they were, I think you were indicating, the best that could be done within that relatively short time frame when you asked that they be commissioned. Is that fair?
Yes, the pricing analysis they did covered everything, but they only looked at 6+6 contracts and process in detail.
All right. Since that time, a lot of data, information, evidence has been made available about the HPL, about the VIP lane. to this inquiry. You're obviously aware of that.
Sure.
Yeah. And it deals with a great many more cases than the 6 plus 6 that the 2 GIA reports looked at. Yeah?
Absolutely. I readily concede the inquiry's got much more information on this than I had at the time, or in fact, or now.
Yeah. And that information includes, does it not, witness statements from 36 of the referrers in. Were you aware of that?
You sent me some tables last night. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, a bit earlier than last night, but nonetheless, you've been looking at some tables, and I'm going to take you to them. But before I do that, were you aware that the inquiry has sought and secured a number of witness statements from referrers into the VIP lane?
Referrers. So, Lord
Referrers,
Agnew, yes, I felt sure you would.
Yes, we're going to look at referrers and we're going to look at caseworkers. So we're going to look at the two ends of the process, as it were. Of those 36 referrers, just over 2/3, 67% of them, tell us that they had conducted. Well, let's have a look at the pie chart that results from those that witness evidence. It's INQ. Thank you very much. It's there already. Evidence of referrers in respect of suppliers which were awarded contracts. 67%, just over 2/3, of referrers into the VIP lane tell us that they can.
That they've done no due diligence.
They've done no due diligence.
Yeah, and that's, I think, my point before. Their offices just shuffled the incoming to whoever they thought was the relevant person in the PPE team to deal with without comment. That doesn't surprise me at all.
So on that basis, whether it's a company offer, an individual offer, whatever type of offer there is no objective basis for concluding that the offer that had come in via a referral in was inherently more credible or solid, to use the language that you did in your witness statement. There isn't a basis for that, is there?
They're more, as I say, they're more likely to be from businesses, but that's why the HPL team, the high priority team, was there to triage these offers to see if they were any good.
Another way of assessing the quality or the inherent credibility or solidity of offers that came in via the VIP lane is to analyse the performance of the contract compared to the performance of contracts outside the HPL within a given time frame, and that time frame must be the same for both. Yeah?
Yeah.
Whether there were problems with the contract or whether the contract performed as it was supposed to do. Well, you may be aware that the inquiry has obtained a lot of data from the DHSC providing information about PPE. You're aware of that?
You sent me that last night, yes.
Yeah. Could we turn then to inquiry document 000582-366, and it's page 4 of that, paragraph 1.5. Performance issues, and we're looking at the top here, high priority lane. And no means it's an offer that's come in outside the high priority lane. Yes means it's come in through the high priority lane. Were there performance issues? Yes, there were for non-high priority lane offers in 39% of the cases. And that's compared to 55% for high priority lane offers. So we've dealt with the due diligence aspect, whether referrers in simply passed them on, as you've acknowledged was normally the case. We now look at performance on that second basis, on that second measure. There is no objective basis upon which to conclude that offers that came in to the VIP lane through referrals were performed better or were therefore inherently more credible or more solid or more promising. That's right as well, isn't it, Mr. Rhys-Williams?
This isn't my data, it's
Of course it's
data.
not.
So I think the question is what sort of performance issue, and I suspect DH have a breakdown of it. Was it an invoice incorrect? Was it customs declaration done wrongly? Or was it quality, as in quality of product? And I don't think this jumps out. What did jump out to me last night when I looked was China buy, which is mainly direct from manufacturers. So the HPL and the things that came into, as I understand it, the things that came into the HPL, non-HPL channels were mainly intermediary type stuff. But it's quite interesting that China buys mainly manufacturers, and you see that lower down, 54 plays 55. You'd have thought the manufacturers would have the best paperwork, best quality. But I can't really, I'm happy to give some observations, but this isn't my data.
This is high level, and you're right that this chart does not identify, it would be a very much more complicated chart if it did, the nature of the defects in the contracts, the reason for performance failures. But what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If there are performance issues inside the HPL and performance issues outside the HPL, the details of which are unknown in both cases, one can, broadly speaking, make the comparison that is made in this chart, can't one? Because what you say would apply also outside the HPL, wouldn't it?
But there could be different mix in different channels of different issues. I don't know that from looking at this.
These are averages.
Yeah, quite.
But do you have contrary evidence upon which to base a conclusion to say that VIP referred offers performed better within the same time period as non-VIP lane ones?
No, but I wouldn't have. That's all for DH. But this is looking ex post. The question is ex ante. That's why all the offers were triaged in the same way. I said yesterday we were already in the place of having inconsistent treatment of offers, because to the China buy team we're looking at a different one set, and we covered that yesterday. So I'm happy to ask one of my ex-team to work with DH to unpick this data a little bit, but I don't think I can help unpick an average.
All right. You gave evidence yesterday afternoon to some degree on speed, and I asked you whether the speed of processing was advantageous, and you raised a point, I think for the first time in any of the evidence that we'd seen, that slowness of processing may be advantageous if it happened to coincide with a moment of need for whatever was being offered.
I think it's in one of my evidence packs, but I would struggle to find the paragraph number, but I'll get it to you. But I think...
Well, I may have missed it, in which case I apologise. In any event, broadly speaking, generally, speed of processing would be more advantageous than slowness of processing, subject to the exception that you raise. Is that fair?
Yes, and the distribution of the speed. If everyone was in a day or two and a different group was in within a day or two, that might be one thing. But I suspect that the range of speeds going through, which is why I didn't try to do the analysis at the time, because I just think we would have got mired in rubbish data. The distribution of how long things take, I think, is probably, and luck, frankly, on whether this vendor took a week to turn around a question that we'd asked them, or that vendor took a day to turn around a question, or an hour to turn around a question, compared to our internal processing, which is, I think, the valid, or the very justifiable question that you're answering. I don't think we know the speed of our processing rather than the total time. But again, this is not my, Chris Hall, I think, has spent more time on the timing data, and the analysis he's done is they were broadly comparable, HPL, non-HPL, good offer to contract.
All right. In high-level terms then, because if Chris Hall is going to be able to give the more detailed evidence, we can ask him about that. But the reason why speed is advantageous is that we're dealing at that time with a very volatile market, a fast-moving market, and the sooner you can get an offer to an eventual decision maker, the better, usually. Right. And I mentioned some guidance, and you expressed some reservations about caveats within that guidance. I think, in fairness, we should look at it now. It's INQ 000 477 274, page 2.
Sorry, what's this from?
This is guidance on progressing offers, 7th of May 2020.
This is instructions to people in the teams.
It's an internal document, I think, exactly, to inform the likes of Mr. Hall when dealing with offers.
Yep.
Yeah. Did you produce it?
Not me personally. No, this was probably written by Andy Woods or one of the people running the opportunities teams.
With your involvement?
No.
Without. Okay. Well, that may be why you're not on top of the detail of it, but let's have a look at that detail now. A closing team, an opportunity should only be progressed if, and then we go down various different criteria here, and then the penultimate bullet, the offer is less than 2 weeks old. Offers more than 2 weeks old are generally not credible in the current market and should not be progressed unless you have expressly confirmed with the case worker that they remain valid. Now, isn't that fairly clear? It may be something that you weren't familiar with at the time or that you're not familiar particularly with now. But on the face of the document, it's fairly clear, isn't it, that a speedier process for an offer will place it at an advantage for this reason, amongst others, for this reason alone, if one is to focus on this reason.
So this is the closing team. So this is after technical assurance, after all the other processes. So I think it's a fair point that they make. If the thing is old, talk to the caseworker. He might well go back and check that the offer was still on the table or hadn't been sold to somebody else.
It's a fair point that they make. Is it a fair point that I make, Mr. Rhys-Williams, that if you can get as far as here in the process within your 2 weeks, then you're in with a shot? Then you might be one of those that is part of the conversion rate, the 1 to 10 conversion rate. That's fair also, isn't it?
Yes, but it also says, unless you've confirmed with the caseworker that it remains valid. So
Yes,
I think
of course,
Chris
there may be exceptions. There may be exceptions.
Well, I don't know if there were exceptions or routine. The average time, according to Chris Hall's analysis, and apologies if I quote this wrongly, I think is 3.5 weeks. So that would slightly imply that everything over 2 weeks, lots of things were being referred back to their caseworker. But I don't know that. You'd have to talk to the team on the ground.
All right, let's go back to some of the charts that arise out of the evidence obtained from the 36 referrers, the witness evidence that was obtained from referrers. It's INQ 000 475 005 and page 2. And you can see there, can you not, Mr. Rhys-Williams, that 61 of the referrers did chase for updates.
61%.
61% of the referrers did chase for updates.
That's the problem, yes.
That's the problem. Why is that the problem?
Because that's the noise that gets generated.
Indeed. It's a problem because it's a distraction, and it's a problem because it brings to the fore offers that may or may not have otherwise been to the fore. If you're getting emails from referrers, particularly senior referrers or their offices, it's only natural, it's only human, isn't it, to prioritise that, to use the word that features in the HPL, the high priority lane.
So, two things to say. I mean, yes, attention is, no one would, I've said already, it would be much better if there was no ministerial office chasing, but I think that's unrealistic. procurers in government are trained to ignore things outside of the matter of the contract or the subject of the offer. And we had a particularly bruising court case that we lost. The NDA lost £100 million that cost us because the procurement team was seen to be non-consistent. So everybody knows to ignore stuff outside of the case in question. But we were where we were, and so I can see why the team decided that an HPL was a single group of people handling these chasings was a better way of doing it, slightly higher caliber people, rather than disaggregating those referrals on a cab rank basis to opportunity team 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, round and round and round, which would have then, given that the requests were bound to come in, the 61%, you'd then have to work out who you'd referred that to, find someone in that team who's probably, more junior. So this is a lesser of two evils problem, and I regret it. There are, in my recommendations, there are a number of ways where I think we could avoid this scenario, but...
Mr. Rees-William, you say that everyone knows to ignore the noise. You mean the caseworkers, don't you? Those on the receiving end of these messages, these emails, whatever.
Well, respond to them, but not take heed of them.
Okay, the inquiry
or use their own judgment is perhaps a better way of putting it.
Use their own judgment. The inquiry has taken evidence from, or has surveyed those caseworkers. It was provided with 20 names of high priority lane caseworkers by the Cabinet Office, you may be aware.
I wasn't, but...
And it surveyed 17 of them. Yeah. Now, the team, it reached levels of as much as 38 in number, didn't it, for the high priority lane?
I'm not across that detail, but yes, you can say so.
38 individuals working within the VIP lane.
Thank you.
Let's display now, in order to see the result of that survey, INQ 000581 860. And we start with the representation of the answer to this question. Did any referrers to the HPL contact you directly? And 15 responses were given, and 53.3% said yes to that.
Yeah, I think that's the mirror of the previous pie chart.
It should be approximately, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
Let's just zoom out again so that we can see, so that we can be clear. Where an individual indicated that they were not contacted or unable to remember, they were not required to fill in the remaining questions. And I draw that to your and the inquiry's attention because the next pie chart does therefore deal only with the 53.3%, those that were contacted.
Uh-huh.
All right. If we could move then down to the next one, which is it page 9? There it is, yeah. Survey also asked the following question. Do you consider contracts in the HPL were treated differently throughout the process to contracts awarded outside of the HPL? For example, in speed, due diligence, assessment of value for money. Now, you say that caseworkers were knew to ignore this stuff, the incoming requests for updates and other forms of intervention. But it looks from this survey result that 66.7, two-thirds, just over two-thirds, of those that responded in the affirmative, that they had been contacted by referrers, did consider that the processing of contracts was different as a result of those interventions.
I'm not sure it quite says that. It says this is the whole purpose of the HPL, was to respond to requests, and we discussed earlier that the non-HPL didn't have as many requests. So the whole purpose of the HPL was to respond to ministerial requests. So it depends. I don't have the detail below this. You put, for example, but if you gave those as those are the only examples you wanted a yes to, then that's fine. But one answer that would get a yes is, yes, we responded to the referrers, and that didn't happen in other non-HPLs. I don't know. I haven't seen the survey details.
So just before we go on, Mr. Hall, just so I follow, 20 people surveyed, because I find percentages can be sometimes
17.
a bit misleading. Basically, it talked about 20 on the previous page. But anyway,
Names of 20 provided.
let's take 20 because it's easier.
Yeah, okay.
If it's 17, then my figures will make it would be even more complicated. Of which 53, so just over half,
Yes,
said they were contacted. So that would be 10 if it were 20.
it would be.
And then 66.7% did think they'd be treated differently. So we're down to about 6. So when we're talking individuals, we're talking 5 individuals, roughly? I'm looking at Mr. Stokes. He knows
It's
his
closer to
figures.
10. There were 15 responses. You can see there at the above on the pie chart. So we're talking about 10. 2/3 of that is 10.
I'm not. Well, in which case, my maths really is failing me. I'm going to have to take this away and think about it. But I mean, I think it might be more helpful if we did try to work out how many individuals, because I find percentages. You know, if you had 100% of people surveyed and you only surveyed 10 people, it's it doesn't give you much help, does it?
Well, it's not an enormous sample size. As I understand this pie chart, it's 2/3 of 15, so 10.
Yeah, but but the 66.7% is of the 53.3%, isn't it? Isn't that what you just told us?
No, I'm sorry. That's not right. That applies to other pie charts. And those other pie charts limit the number of responses. This one, we know the actual number of responses because it's indicated
The 15.
on the screen and on the slide. It's 15 responses.
So these aren't 15 people who said they had been contacted, which the first pie chart showed us. This is not relating to the first pie chart.
That's right. This 15 responded, and all of them had been contacted, and a quarter of them approximately said no, they didn't feel like the result was anything different within the HPL, but 2/3 said yes, they did think that there had been different treatment as a result of that contact.
I think I'm getting a bit confused here. Could someone just take... We're taking up time and it's not fair on Mr. Rees-Williams. So if someone could try and work out for me exactly what these figures mean in terms of individuals, roughly. I appreciate 7.1 individuals doesn't exist, but just to give me a vague idea of how many individuals as opposed to percentages.
We'll certainly do that, my lady.
Thank
But
you.
before we move on
I'm
from
sorry,
this
and what
project-
element of difference? Because I think that's important. I would be disappointed if that meant that people had progressed things faster for no otherwise meritorious reason.
Well, this is
but they
the
were
point
there to respond to requests. So
This is the point I wanted to raise with you, Mr. Rees-Williams. You said earlier that everyone knows to ignore this stuff, to use the phrase that you did. Everyone knows to use their judgment rather than to respond to ministerial intervention or contact or communication. What is clear from this slide is that that isn't what was happening. Do you consider contracts in the HPL were treated differently through the process outside? To say yes to that implies, does it not, that something different was done in relation to speed and due diligence and assessment of value for money?
or other elements. I don't know. I mean, I have to talk to the 10 people who ticked the blue box.
Could I just ask a question, Mr. Rees-Williams? The professor yesterday suggested that one of the ways you might have been able to deal with the update, the pressure, let's call it pressure in inverted commas for ministers, saying what's happening, was basically to tell the ministers to back off. In other words, to send a message out, I don't know, from number 10 or wherever. Look, nothing's going to happen. You can put as much pressure on as you like, but everything's just going to keep going on. So just stop wasting our time. Did anybody think about doing that rather than setting up the high priority lane?
Much of the pressure emanated from people in number 10. So I think, that's just find 100 civil servants and ask them that question and see how much they smile. I mean, I just...
Well, it just is not realistic to tell ministers to back off. Or tell
well, and
them
it's,
to back off, certainly.
if it's not interfere, and this, Mr. Ward makes a great point, and these questions are absolutely appropriate. For a minister to ask a question that what's called in civil service speaks, directs you to do something, is a very high stakes thing. But asking for an update, these are the elected representatives. We work for Parliament. We work for them. They are right to scrutinise our speed of work and make pithy comments about how we're doing it in all sorts of shapes and forms, and that is uncomfortable sometimes. But this is a slightly more philosophical question, but I think in our structure, civil servants report to their ministers and have to respond to questions for them.
It's part of the DNA.
Yes, and I tried to draw the distinction yesterday. In normal times, you publish a timetable of when different award stages are going, when perhaps you go from 5 vendors down to 3, down to 2, down to 1. And after those decision meetings have been had, then it's appropriate to update the minister or whoever outside of the decision-making process, but who has a legitimate interest subject to confidentiality and so on and so forth. But this was not that environment. This was chaos every minute.
Thank you, my lady. Just 2 more points on the graphs, if I may. You commissioned the 2 GIA reports because of concern or reports in the media about cronyism. There were allegations of cronyism that you were concerned about and wanted to investigate. Isn't that the case?
I wanted to know if I had overlooked something, yes.
Yeah. And those reports allayed your concerns, didn't they?
And as far as they could do. I did a couple of other exercises myself that we've discussed one of them. We haven't discussed the pricing one.
The inquiry was also concerned and conducted its own analysis, and the result of that can be displayed INQ 000475005 at page 3. You were aware, were you not, that the successful awards were overwhelmingly, so far as we know, from referrals in of those that were members or supporters of the Conservative Party, the then government?
Sorry, the question's in several bits there. So this chart, I think, is talking for things coming through the HPL rather than the total.
HPL?
The total footprint.
It's looking at the degree to which successful contracts through the HPL, were affiliated politically to the Conservative Party rather than any other party.
Well, I think most of the referrals came from ministerial offices, so no surprise they were Conservative at the time. So I think the question is, was it causal, which is a very good question to ask.
Does the result of this analysis doesn't surprise you? Is that what I take from your last answer?
Well, I think it's encouraging that more came through the civil service, and probably by civil service you also mean NHS. I'm not sure you can draw a huge amount from this.
It doesn't concern you, Mr. Rees-Williams, that there is no representation of referrals in relation to successful contracts through the HPL from any other party? That doesn't, to you, signal some problem with the HPL process?
I think it is more than not believable that civil servants would winnow out a good offer because it came from the Labour Party. I would be appalled. I just can't believe that. Now, you'll talk to colleagues to find out, why. It might be a good question to them. Referrals that came from non-conservative sources, what was the issue with those offers? I don't have that detail, but civil servants are trained to be apolitical in the sort. They're trained to look at the offer.
All right, let's go back, as I said I would, to the figures. You were concerned about, you've made your comments about the 90% figure from Professor Sanchez-Correas of yesterday. I'm not going to go back to that. I do want to go back to the 17 times conversion rate that I mentioned in opening. Let's start, if we may, with INQ 000528391. It's a witness statement, not yours, but of Mr. Jonathan Maron, who is due to give evidence after you today. Page 192, table 11.
Yeah.
And we see there, within the HPL, 430 potential suppliers. 51 were awarded contracts.
And you used 430 in your chart that drove the 17 and a half.
No, well, let's take it in stages.
For offers, not suppliers.
Mr. Rhys-Williams, would you allow me to take this in stages? Because it's not obvious stuff and it needs to be explained.
No, this is really complicated. That's why it's important to get it right.
Please allow me, if I get it wrong, you'll say so, but wait for me to do so if you wouldn't mind. 430 potential suppliers, 51 suppliers awarded contracts. That is a conversion rate in terms of suppliers of 11.86%. Yeah.
And that, I think, correlates with the 10% that was from the data set, but only halfway through the pandemic. So I assume this is for the full pandemic data.
Non-HPL, many more potential suppliers. We're still talking about suppliers.
Yes.
15,194, 173 suppliers awarded contracts.
Yes.
That's a conversion rate of 1.13% with suppliers.
Yes.
Which gives an overall conversion rate comparison of 10.5 times, roughly 10. Focusing on suppliers. Yes?
Yeah, well,
now, the reason for the 17 times conversion rate, it arises out of a focus not on suppliers, but on offers, because, as you know, some suppliers secured multiple contracts.
And lots of suppliers made multiple offers, yes.
Yes, exactly. So let's have a look at that.
Yeah, I'm just remembering that the table you put up on your opening statement had 430 in a box called offers, not suppliers. And you were comparing that with 22,000, I didn't screenshot it, of non-HPL offers. So I suspect, my lady, that the HPL companies beneath it were probably bigger. This is back to who they contacted, were bigger and therefore likely more offers per company. But I don't know that. That's just, and that's, that is an assumption.
The total number of offers rather than suppliers is significantly higher than the number we looked at earlier. It's 24,000.
That sounds about right, yes.
Yeah. Of which 430 were offers in the HPL.
No, 430 is the number of suppliers in the HPL. They would definitely have had more than one offer per supplier, and therefore, I think you just picked somewhere. I think it'd be good if your analyst and Chris Hall or someone from DH could get together, because these are really important numbers. And to put out that it's 17.5 times more likely, I think it's probably a factor of 3 or 4 less than that. We need to get to the right answer, and there are lessons to learn about the data, and I'm not trying to hide behind that.
When you say
I agree, Mr. Wall. And what concerns me is that there could be a misleading headline if we don't get these figures correct.
All right.
And that misleading headline
I
would
wonder,
be
do
unfair
you perhaps-
for everybody.
Sorry, Melody, sorry, I shouldn't have. I wondered, do you have the slide that you gave us on the opening statement? Because I think that would make the point that I made.
I'm not sure I can summon it up at a moment's notice, but certainly we will take up the suggestion of trying to agree the figure.
Well, maybe if we take the morning break now, I don't know how much, I'd appreciate that Mr. Stote's going to take over the questioning. How much more questioning have you got of the witness, Mr. Wall?
Not very much. A matter of a few minutes.
Melody, this is quite complicated. I mean, perhaps we could write to you when we've all got together about this. And analysing this is really difficult. And I don't...
I understand that. Don't worry. I've certainly got that point, if I'm not following the figures. I think I'll take the break now. The team can consider how much progress we're likely to make asking these questions at the moment before doing the work that you suggested. I shall return at 20 past. All rise. Mr. Wall, where have we got to?
My lady, we'll see if we can get any further on this, and if not, we will, as you suggest, Mr. Rhys-Williams, we will take it offline. We'll try and agree figures. You did ask that the representation, the donut diagram that was used in opening, be displayed. So shall we start with that so that we can understand your concern?
Sure.
It's INQ 000474992.
Yes, and that's what I'm getting at. On the top right there, milady, high priority off lane offers 430. That's, I believe, a transcription error, whatever. Whereas the 23,570 on the left-hand side at 9 o'clock, I think that is much more likely to be actual offers, whereas the 430, I believe, is suppliers. And I think the offers number is more like 2,000, 2,500, something like that, but I defer to my colleagues.
If it were offers, if contrary to what you've just said, it were offers, then it would affect the conversion rate, wouldn't it?
No.
If that is correct, you say that that relates to suppliers, and that, of course, is what Mr. Marin says in his evidence. We looked at his table.
I've not seen his
Well,
table,
we
but
saw
I
it a
think,
few
well,
minutes.
can I put it the other way around? I think it's most unlikely that there was one offer per HPL supplier. Exactly one. I think that's...
No one's suggesting that. Let's
Well,
just...
Yes,
except
you are.
in another,
That is-
another map, sorry, forgive me, haven't we got 430 as the figure for suppliers under the high priority lane?
That's
Isn't
my,
that the
that's my point, my lady.
In other words, it's a bit of a coincidence. You've got 430 suppliers in one map and 430 offers, I think is the point
Well,
Mr. Rhys-Williams is making.
Let's have the source of the figure of 430 for suppliers is the table that we looked at just before the short break.
I think that is right, 430 suppliers. I think the offers number on this slide is where the transcription has perhaps gone wrong.
Let's have a look at the source of the 430 figures for offers rather than suppliers then. Could we have INQ 000565970, please?
Pardon me.
It doesn't look as if we're going to resolve this swiftly. We've got many other questions I know Mr. Stote has for Mr. Rhys-Williams. I think we'd better move on.
All right, my lady.
We'll try and resolve it offline with your assistance.
Thank you, Melody. Could I make one final comment while the team are changing over, which we've not talked about, but I think is relevant? So in the early days of the pandemic, we bought everything, and there's maybe criticism that we bought too much. That's a slightly different thing. We bought everything we could. And the market, what's called cleared. So if we didn't buy it, someone else bought it. There was no surplus PPE anywhere on the planet for the first few months. I don't know the date exactly, but the market cleared. So it is surprising how few, like half a dozen or so, I talked to them in my evidence pack, milady, of people complained that we did not take their offer. So I think we went through, or the team went through all the low priority ones, and as we discussed, we bought everything we could. And so I think there's the pricing point. I know you're going to talk about when I'm not here, but I don't understand where this 80% increase in cost numbers come from, and hopefully when you see the charts, you'll make your own mind up. But also, very few other people complain, so I don't see where the process has its faults, as I'm very open about. We were where we were in terms of process, and Professor Sanchez-Guerra is very right to make the comments that he did on that. All the product was sold by everyone who offered anything. It went to us or other countries. I don't think HMG lost out materially on price, though that's obviously, you must make your own mind up. And the process was not perfect, but the GIA and Boardman said the process was, there were data gaps for reasons we've discussed. So but I think that market clearing and limited number of complaints. Suppliers to government complain at the drop of a quarter hat, and there were half a dozen or so.
Thank you. Mr. Stote.
Thank you, Milady. Mr. Rhys-Williams, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to pivot to a completely new topic, if I may. I'm going to ask you questions focused on the procurement of ventilators during the pandemic. Just a few background questions first. Given the nature of COVID-19 as a disease and its impact on respiratory systems, and of course, as you've told us, looking across from the UK to the EU to Europe, the availability of ventilators during the pandemic was initially thought to be critical for treating those suffering from the disease. Is that right?
I believe so.
In very simple terms, I think I use your phrase here, ventilators, we're talking about medical devices that move air into and out of a person's lungs and which were used or could be used to take over the body's breathing process when COVID-19 caused the lungs to fail and allowing a patient time to fight off the infection and recover.
Yes.
You say that in early March, this is in your statement of 2020, the advice from the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE, was that in the reasonable worst-case scenario, excess deaths from COVID-19 could be 520,000 within 3 months, and that some 781,000 people would require ventilation at some point whilst hospitalised. Yes?
Those are SAGE's numbers, not...
Yeah, but they're what you cite to us. Prior to the pandemic, the purchasing of ventilators, along with most other medical equipment, was carried out by individual NHS trusts. Is that right?
Yes, subject to what we talked about yesterday with SSCL doing mainly commodities, but I believe equipment was mainly bought by trusts directly.
You note in your evidence there was no central list of how many ventilators were held by the NHS or what model or specification they were.
That's correct. That's what I'd learned at the time.
Yes, and you observed this. We had not anticipated the need for ventilators and so started the pandemic with many fewer than I believe is the case for other countries on a per capita basis, which meant we were always going to be scrambling to rectify the situation. You say not having an inventory of how many ventilators, what type, age, state of repair and where made trying to estimate how many we would need even harder. Yes?
Yes.
So you've given us those very large figures from SAGE. In your evidence, you say in March 2020, looking at right at the beginning of the pandemic, it was tentatively estimated by DHSC and NHS England that the NHS had access to something like 6,000 to 8,000 ventilators. Yes?
I believe so, yes.
But that, on that reasonable worst-case scenario we looked at, 30,000 would be required by April of 2020 and some 90,000 required by November of 2020. In other words, the modelling you were receiving indicated that the number of ventilated beds required would exceed supply both soon and essentially very significantly so. Is that right?
Yeah, in the final case, 82,000.
Yes. Briefly, the manufacture of ventilators is a complex process, isn't it?
Yes, they're complicated machines.
And very different from many of the PPE sectors, which will obviously receive attention from the inquiry. It's a sophisticated combination, isn't it, of electronics, batteries, software, gas delivery systems, monitoring, alarms, many moving parts.
Yeah, about 300 or so to 500 bits, components per, depending on what the model is, my lady.
You say in your evidence, at this early stage, global demand for ventilators, because of course everyone was seeing the same thing, weren't they, meant that there was no confidence that significant number of ventilators could be sourced from existing producers, and it was likely to be difficult to purchase the key materials to buy all those parts. Is that right?
Yes, and I should add also, a number of countries had export bans. Sorry.
Yes. This was a global problem, wasn't it? Not just a UK problem.
Indeed.
Looking at the UK, though, there were, as you say, no large-scale domestic producers of any ICU, intensive care unit mechanical ventilators in the UK, or domestic companies with current lines of ventilators licensed for sale. This is looking at March 2020, is that right?
Yes, there was one company, UK company, Diamedica, who did have a product sold, I believe, in Saharan Africa, but that was not licensed for the UK, but it was a UK company. But that's not an ICU ventilator. There are different flavours of ventilator.
Yes,
which we might get into.
We don't need to get into that for these questions. There may come a point when we do. But summarising this, you've now got very significant excess death estimates, very significant estimates of how many ventilators needed, many fewer of those ventilators available, an overheated global market, and no domestic production of those devices. Is that right?
Yeah.
And as such, is this correct? Your focus, and this is where you come in, effectively, isn't it? Your focus became domestic production of ventilators.
Yeah, we always knew that was going to be a very long shot, but there were no other options available than to put. There's a different statistic that you haven't mentioned, but is relevant. There was a chart that we all saw at the beginning of the ventilator challenge period that looked at cases and number of ventilators, the 6,000 to 8,000 that you mentioned. And I think I'm right in remembering that someone reversed out the numbers and said, well, after 2 weeks, at projected rates, 3,000 people a week would die through lack of ventilators.
Putting a date on it, 12th of March, what you tell us is that the Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, had a call with the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Michael Gove, along with members of the government commercial function, discussing an urgent need for ventilators. And it's at this point that the idea arose of getting a group of UK-based companies together to assist with manufacturing more of them. Is that right?
Yes, I wasn't at that meeting, but one of my colleagues was, who came back and talked to me about it immediately afterwards.
The next day, you emailed Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, and Steve Oldfield, the Chief Commercial Officer at DHSC, with an idea, seeking their views on an idea to assemble a team of engineers to basically design and make a new, simple, mass manufacturable ventilator. Is that right?
Yes, of a very simple sort. So I'd been thinking overnight, what could we do? So I used to run a company that made toilet hand dryers, so I knew a little bit about the technology, and I was imagining something that might be for home use, very basic, but we could hopefully make hundreds of thousands of. but you'll probably come to this, but I was rapidly educated by the clinicians that was not what they wanted.
Yes. Yes, we'll come to that. But still at this very early stage, you spoke to Sir John Manzoni, Chief Executive of the Civil Service and Permanent Secretary of the Cabinet Office, discussed a two-pronged, centrally led approach to securing, I think you were fairly rapidly educated, because you tell us at this stage what was actually needed was more high-end ventilators for the NHS. Is that right?
That's right, yes. The doctors were very clear that they didn't need what they referred to as bag squeezers. And this is because, my lady, ventilators, the patient is unconscious at the time and you've got tubes going down into you. That's rather different from a mask on your face which pumps air to you, which still goes through your lungs and therefore your body can protect yourself. And that was the education point that I rapidly understood.
Yes. These two prongs, this two-pronged approach, first prong, buy as many ventilators as possible from the UK and global suppliers. That was an exercise led by the Department of Health and Social Care with a joint unit to secure overseas opportunities, which included the FCO and the Department of International Trade.
That's right, yes, we should carry on. They had already been trying to buy as many as they could, but we should absolutely reinforce that and put more people into it and try and buy as many as we could in the market, obviously.
Yes, and secondly, to work with suppliers and manufacturers here to increase the production of ventilators in the UK, and that became what we now know as the Ventilator Challenge. Is that right?
Correct.
That was led by the Cabinet Office. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Forgive me.
Well, I mean, it was me and my team. I mean,
yeah. And you, because, as you've already told us, you had a procurement role and a private sector engineering background.
And I'd worked in medical devices, as it happened, and, you know, I didn't know anyone else around who, you know, could do it, so I allocated myself to this.
Yes, it fell to you. You became the senior responsible officer and the accounting officer for the Ventilator Challenge, is that right?
Yes.
And you tell us you dedicated most of your time until mid-April and a still very significant amount of your time until the end of June to that Ventilator Challenge, is that right?
Correct.
Looking then at how this worked, you tell us that the approach is taken to meeting the challenge, as it's being now called, first identify and then increase the production of existing designs, and secondly develop new designs, is that right?
Yes, because there were designs. There was a Smiths, who are an excellent engineering company, had what's called a transport ventilator, which is a low-end one. It's not, you can't use it, you know, for an extended period of time, and they were UK-based and had a UK license. So obviously we wanted to scale them up, and they wanted to scale up as fast as they could, but that was never going to cover the gap between what we could buy in the market, which was a few hundreds, and, you know, these thousands that were then projected.
In both cases, either increasing the production of existing designs or developing new designs, you tell us it was necessary for any such machines to secure the approval of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Before they would be put into production and receive contracts for manufacture.
Absolutely, yeah.
The aim at this stage, clearly very ambitious, if we're looking back at those SAGE statistics and what you're told by NHS England, essentially to make 30,000 ventilators in 8 weeks. Is that right?
Yeah.
In its earliest stages, a team from a company called PA Consulting was enlisted to undertake project management. Is that right?
Yes, PA are a well-known management consultant, but they are more about product development and operational than other well-known strategy consultants, let's say. And I happen to know, because I worked with them before, that they had a medical base in Cambridge, and Cambridge is a centre of medical device developers. So, and PA were already contracted to government, so it was, frankly, a logical and quick route to get the external expertise that we were going to need, because we needed a lot of people on this overnight, immediately, with knowledge of the people we were going to be working with.
Yes, and you also tell us, in addition to them, various design consultancy companies were contracted to deploy teams of scientists and engineers, support the supply chain and procurement, and to assist in scaling up as quickly as possible. That was sort of the early work of the...
two in parallel, and that's what was unusual here. Normally you design the thing and then you work out how to scale it up. There was no time for that. So we engaged a whole lot of design teams, these medical device companies around Cambridge and others that came in at the same time as we were trying to work out if they come up with something that works in the MHRA's eyes, clinicians' eyes, how would we scale it up to make, well, to essentially triple the UK stock, which we'd obviously acquired over many years.
You tell us on the 16th of March, the Prime Minister convened a meeting with around 60 leading manufacturers and suppliers to encourage them to participate. You described that as the targeted call to arms. Is that right?
Yes, because it is quite a small industry, medical devices in the UK, and we wanted to get urgent attention to senior people in those companies that we were serious about what. At one level, what we were trying to do was impossible. No one had ever thought that this was doable. So we needed people to participate, and they were all keen to. So the meeting that the Prime Minister convened that I was at was a mixture of medical device companies, the design companies, and the people who are likely to be able to help scale it up. And that's, the major manufacturers of volume product, car companies, aerospace companies. And one of the things we asked them to do is, who else do you consider would be useful to get into the tent? And that's what I mean by a targeted call to arms, rather than what happened with PPE, where we just, everyone in the country was invited to ring in, which, we discussed yesterday.
There seemed to be something of that. You say on the same date, 16th of March, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, did publish a wider call for businesses to help make NHS ventilators. You describe it in your statement as the wider public request for help. That received over 5,300 offers of support eventually. You said yesterday in your evidence that, quote, nearly broke the back of the team.
So those, Melody, those 5,000 or so, all well-meaning, were mainly making components for air conditioning systems, which is a similar problem but different. So they were relevant, but they weren't designers of ventilators. We pretty much got that group, and they weren't the large manufacturers, because we'd already identified Ford and Airbus and the obvious large manufacturers. But nonetheless, obviously, we had to go through each and every one, because there might have been a nugget in there that we had missed, and it, so we went through all 5,000, obviously.
Yes. And you've discussed some of that with Mr. Wald yesterday. In terms of how the Ventilator Challenge selected its designs, okay, so the proposals and prototypes that came to it, you established something that you called the Technical Design Authority, the TDA, yes, to make recommendations on proposed suppliers' ventilator designs to ministers based on clinical observations. Is that right?
That's right. The TDA was a mixture of clinicians, me, a couple of people from PA, and the MHRA representative.
Yes. So we've got, in this Technical Design Authority, you've got the MHRA for regulatory oversight and approval. Is that right? You've got senior clinicians led by Professor Ramani Munasinghe, the National Clinical Care Director.
That's right.
We'll be hearing from her later.
Yep.
She gives clinical sign-off, so not regulatory, but clinical sign-off. And she tells us in her statement her role here was ultimately to decide go and no-go in terms of designs in the Ventilator Challenge. Is that right?
Yes, but she had a group of brilliant doctors working with her, also told us what they wanted in terms of the spec. And while the spec was signed by the MHRA, and as luck would have it, the Duncan McPherson, who was the MHRA rep, had also been an anaesthetist in his prior career, and so knew what he was talking about. So the clinicians generated the spec with the MHRA, explaining what we wanted, what they wanted. And of course, over time, as we learnt more, perhaps we'll come to this, as that spec did evolve, as we learnt more about the disease in the days and weeks that followed.
Yes, the initial spec wasn't the one at the end, was it? Because understanding changed and so forth.
The balance within the spec, but there was a particular thing you may remember, lady, on the telly seeing patients having to be rotated because they generated a lot of mucus on their lungs. And that would, I think, for the clinicians, I don't speak for them, Ramani will talk to this, I'm sure, I don't think they'd expected that. And so the initial spec didn't include machines, the requirement to deal with that mucus, but that later that became a key item, so that the spec evolved over the days and a couple of weeks.
Just finally on the Technical Design Authority, you've got MHRA senior clinicians, and you also tell us Professor Tom Clutton-Brock, Director of the Medical Devices Testing and Evaluation Centre, or MD Tech, which actually carried out the testing of these prototypes of machines, is that right?
That's right. So he was he was not part of the MHRA, but he was an approved testing house. And I think what is really noteworthy here is the MHRA, the clinicians, and Professor Tom were all trying very hard to not just wait for a design to come and then assess it like a marking an exam. They were coaching all the teams on what they wanted. Oh, we don't think that'll work. Have you tried this? If you talk to them, that might work. You could solve that problem by doing this. So it was the regulator had absolutely the right to say no, and that's vital. But there was a coaching to get an answer relationship, and I think that was a large part of why we were able to do this so fast.
This might be obvious, but you do tell us in your statement, as ventilators are used to push air into the lungs of unconscious patients, it's incredibly important that they were clinically safe. Was that the basis for the reason for this Technical Design Authority and the way you'd structured it?
Well, I certainly, so if it was a normal procurement with an established spec, and you would always have evaluators who knew the subject matter. I knew nothing about ventilators worth talking about. And so the clinicians and the MHRA were the absolutely key determinants of whether they thought a machine would work. Now, it had to work, or be likely to work when when the design was completed, but it was also vital, milady, that we were able to scale it up. And so simple designs, what's called design for manufacture, was also a big issue, as was, do we think we can get all the components to assemble this enormous piece of Lego, 400 components per each? Because if we might have a brilliant design that was scalable, but if we couldn't get one part of it, a ventilator with 399 parts is useless, obviously.
And so, if I've understood your evidence, the way you tackled that aspect, we looked at the clinical and the safety aspect, from a commercial and manufacture point of view, the idea was to match companies with experience of manufacturing high-spec products at scale with those who had the expertise in designing actual ventilators. Is that right? So, for example, you give the example of pairing Penlon, a medical supplier, with Ford and McLaren motor companies, Siemens, Airbus, and others who could manufacture at scale. That was kind of how you proceeded, is that right?
Exactly, and we also forced each of the companies with a design to give us what's called their bill of materials, the list of componentry, so that we could avoid someone accidentally, but for good intentions, buying all of the oxygen valves, their machine then not working, or even if it did work, if someone had all the oxygen valves and someone else had all the flow meters, you still couldn't put the kits together. So we were very clear that we needed to control the components.
You say you did this in terms of the Cabinet Office's input to achieving that. There were dedicated points of contact at the Cabinet Office, and you went about making staff available, a staff of project management and design specialists, supply chain support, manufacturing development support, legal support, and cost and auditing support to provide tailored advice. So they were all there through the process, is that correct?
Yes, the design contracts were let on what's called time and materials. We'll come back to how we were contracted, I suspect. But we were required, all of the suppliers, to prove their costs. And we said we would pay reasonable and provable costs. And we used a team from the MOD who do this the whole time for defence equipment to go and audit the fact that their hour rates were reasonable and had been what they had been pre-pandemic, and we weren't being gouged, and that the components really had cost what they said, and the meter for this or the the tool for that had cost what they said it had cost.
Cabinet Office support could, on occasion, be financial, couldn't it? You give the example of advancing sums of money to design teams to enable them to buy components that either had long lead times or were in danger of selling out.
Correct.
In terms of how many designs came through the process, they were sort of whittled down, weren't they, through this iterative process by the Technical Design Authority, is that right?
Yes, though 3 or 4 or 5 did join a week or so later, and bizarrely, one person we kicked out on their own dollar progressed their design and came back in with a much more improved thing, which I think just shows the determination of the people in the team to cooperate and get a result for the UK. So all I'm trying to say is it wasn't a complete pyramid. There were people coming in and out and joining later as they caught up.
A whittling down, but a slightly more nuanced one, perhaps.
Correct.
In the end, is this right? 3 companies, but can you recall, actually, before I go there, how many designs did you start out with, and can you recall?
Well,
I've seen different numbers, 18, 19...
Well, I would say it was about 30 or so to start with, but some of them were of the bag squeezer type, which the clinicians, rejected, as soon as they saw the videos. No, not remotely. So there was probably 15, 18 or so that we took into series, that we spent money with. Let's put it like that.
In the end, after the process of the Technical Design Authority evaluation and progressive reduction, as you describe it, and the number of prototypes being supported, and taking into account, as you've summarised, can I summarise in this way, the evolution of the technical specifications and regulatory requirements as more was understood about COVID-19, and taking into account forecasts in relation to demand, how many were needed or likely to be needed, and you say commercial considerations. What do you mean by commercial considerations?
So were they likely to get the bits? Later, when it looked towards the end of the programme, my lady, when it looked like we did have it was amazing to get one viable design. The fact that we got 7 at the end of the day was extraordinary. We did ask the clinicians what mix of units would they like. We talked about transport ventilators versus ICU ventilators. How would they like us to buy that to optimise what they thought they needed at the time? But that was a later consideration.
Yes. As you say, 3 companies, so in terms of the numbers, 3 companies ended up being awarded a total of 5 contracts. They were the successful ones. Another 4 had clinically viable prototypes, but because demand by that stage had reduced in terms of the number of ventilators needed in the NHS, those other 4 didn't receive contracts. Are they the sort of final figures?
They didn't receive build contracts. Yes, perhaps worth explaining a little bit.
Yes, please do.
So the MHRA is allowed. They have emergency procedures, and they're allowed to authorise devices in a rush to meet an emergency need. But once it really looked like the 3 that we will come on to were able to manufacture the volume in the appropriate way with appropriate designs, then the MHRA were clear that they could not extend that emergency umbrella to the remaining designs. Now, as it happened, we managed to get all 3 of the products that we did manufacture, what's called CE marked, with a little quality symbol, which allowed them then to be used in non-emergency mode after the end of the pandemic, which is obviously much more useful for the NHS.
Is it correct that ultimately only companies that at the start of the pandemic had a complete but unlicensed design, or a design that could be adjusted to the specific needs of COVID-19 related care, did in fact obtain contracts through the Ventilator Challenge for the supply of ventilators?
I wouldn't put it like that.
Okay.
So the three manufacturers, Breas had a new product. They're an established ventilator company in Switzerland, and we essentially arranged a license with them, and we paid for them to build a second line alongside their first line in Sweden. There were no export bans from Sweden, so that worked. So that was a new product. They just launched it, but it was a new product from an established player, so that's why we had confidence it would work. The Smiths product that we stood up, that's the transport ventilator. They did amazing things. I think they multiplied their volume by, I forget exactly, 5 or 6. Astonishing, but they are not useful in hospitals. They're useful in ambulances and for moving people around in the hospital, but they're not useful for more than a few hours. I'm sure Ramani will give you much better on that. The big volume that we got was from a company called Penlon. Penlon made previously a very small volume of anesthesia machines, which I don't think actually even them were licensed in the UK at the time. And by luck, their product was modular. So we were able to take one module from this machine, one module from that machine, one module from that machine, and bolt them together. So that was a new product in the MHRA's eyes. I mean, it'd be a bit like taking the gearbox out of one car, the engine out of another car, and the tyres off. Is that a new car? Well, yes, probably, but it had components. So it's not quite as clear cut as your question.
Well, I certainly didn't mean to imply any criticism in there. Just in terms of what came through the process, really. So you talked in some detail there about the 3 companies that got it. Did any entirely new ventilator models, or were any entirely new ventilator models procured as a result of the Ventilator Challenge, or was it all?
Yeah, the Penlon one was a new product.
Okay. Based on a previous design, is that as you've said?
Well, several previous designs for doing something different.
Okay.
So it's like saying, well, to use the automotive example, taking 3 different bits of different tractors and making a sports car out of it.
Understood.
It's a massive. Ramani and other colleagues will talk about the detail, but this is a massive piece of work they did.
Yes. In terms of what the Ventilator Challenge achieved, is this figure right? I think 14,000 ventilators were produced in 3 months during the early pandemic.
Yeah.
That number was deemed to be sufficient to meet, along with ones acquired from abroad, some acquired overseas, and we're looking at that later. That was sufficient to meet the NHS demand, wasn't it?
Yes, that plus the 6,000 to 8,000 the NHS had, plus the few thousand that they bought. Yeah, that got to the 30,000 that the ministers asked us for.
Yeah, I think in the end it was 18,000, but by then the demand had reduced to 18,000, exactly. So the target was met in what looks like large part by the procurement through the Ventilator Challenge.
Yes.
You may have seen or may be aware we've received witness statements from some of the suppliers and manufacturers. Many of them talk of quite significant pride in being involved in the Ventilator Challenge. Does that reflect your overall experience of what was done?
It was extraordinary.
To give a flavour of that, millions of components sourced, purchased and shipped from suppliers across the world, often in direct competition with other countries, facing similar challenges in very short timescales.
Yeah, I think 40 million. We bought 40 million components to do this.
Testing equipment built and quality assured, sometimes from scratch, presumably?
Yep. Particularly at Smiths, they had to replicate their lines, and that was a very big difficulty for them, was building the testers for their line.
Manufacturing space previously used for non-medical industries, things like, as you said, automotive or aeronautical engineering, converted at speed to house new manufacturing lines building ventilators?
Yeah, Ford, Airbus, Siemens all stood up new lines. I think the important point there is it's not just the space. The reason we went with the industrial partners, to call them that, my lady, that we did was that they were coming from industries that had quality systems that are used to traceability. So obviously in aerospace, you want to know where the wheel came from that goes on your airplane. I'm taking a bad example. But in the medical industry, that is similarly vital. And so we were focused on people who were used to really tight quality management, because obviously that was crucial for the product we were trying to make.
Finally, training devised and implemented for hundreds of people staffing new manufacturing lines as well. Is that right?
Yes, that was astonishing. I mean, you used some really novel new tools for explaining designs to people on the line. And we also designed training for each of it might have been the 7 products or a long list that was in the same format to try to make it as easy as could possibly be, given these were new machines for the NHS. So the training materials, the training videos were all done in the same way, same format, so that a nurse in the middle of the night could, find what they needed to make the machines work properly.
The project, is this right, achieved in manufacturing terms, manufacturing and commercial terms, in a number of weeks what would ordinarily have taken years?
I think Penlon made in 8 weeks what they would normally have done in 20 years, yes.
Yeah. You'll understand that the focus of some of my next questions is to understand whether lessons can be learned from this programme, and you will have seen some of the comments made by the Module 5 experts and others, so you're aware of some of that. Mm-hmm. First, I want to ask you about the involvement of the appliance designer and manufacturer Dyson in the Ventilator Challenge. I ask this partly because you say in your 4th witness statement, I'm only aware of one contract, the contract with Dyson, where I was asked to put a contract in place against the commercial guidance.
Yes.
You said in your evidence yesterday and today, it's a distinction you've drawn a few times now, when asked about ministerial pressure, you said pressure can take many forms. A minister saying, have you done this yet, is one thing. Their office more usually chasing up, you said you'd have this done by now, have you? Annoying but fair. And then you said this, that's very different from a minister saying, buy this from them, which is not right. And in my experience, only happened to me in one situation. Were you referring to the Dyson situation? Yep. You were. I also ask about this because the witness statement provided to the inquiry by Dan Webster, do you know Mr. Webster?
Yeah, Dan's one of the complex transactions team that was working with me on this.
Yeah, Deputy Director in the complex transactions team says, quote, I was aware at the time that there were political sensitivities around Dyson because, as I understood it, James Dyson, that's the chairman of the company, James Dyson was a donor to the Conservative Party.
Yep.
Was that known to you as well?
I didn't know he was a donor, but he has a very active PR department, so he was making a lot of noise. We had agreed with all the other participants not to issue any press at all. The reason my thinking on that was these were very small companies. Dyson is not a very small company. Dyson is a huge company, but with the smaller people, I did not want them doorstepped by gangs of journalists. When these are companies of 10 or 20 or 30 people, they did not need that. And so we'd agreed with everyone there'd be no press, but that wasn't the case with Dyson. Yes,
we'll come back to that, I'm sure. I'm just going to go through it in stages, if I may, in terms of the time. And I stress that the focus of my questions is the system in place, the procurement system, the system of the ventilator challenge that you put in place, how that responded to this example, and what lessons we can learn in the future. Okay, so that's very much the tenor of these questions. The statement provided to the inquiry by Claire Gibbs, I think she's your successor, is that right?
Not actually, but she ran the suppliers team, and my successor was appointed 3 weeks ago. So she was covering part of my role in the interim, perhaps better word.
Your interim successor, fair enough. She tells us on the 13th of March, and I go to that date because obviously it's very early on in your, in fact, it's the same day that you sort of had the germ of the idea for the ventilator challenge, isn't it? She says, on that day, there was a call between Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and James Dyson about ventilators. Same day that you sent your message to Steve Oldfield and Patrick Vallance suggesting this group of engineers, getting them together. In your message to Steve Oldfield, you specifically mention Dyson. That's the manufacturer you mention. Maybe to work with E.G. Dyson and a few others to see what might be possible urgently. Why did you suggest Dyson at that very early stage?
So Dyson, fantastic company. They do the products we all know. Plastic tubing, air movement, filters. And the product I was thinking about sort of from 2 in the morning on the 13th till 6 in the morning was, a mask, some filters, a fan, how to get extra air into. This is this is a good reason why I'm not a doctor. And so I was initially looking for people in that space who could do that sort of work. We also talked to G-Tech, who are a competitor of Dyson's.
Another appliance manufacturer, is that right?
Correct, yes. And they are very good at scaling up manufacturing. But they went through the same process, I'm sure we'll come on to, as everyone else. And as we can perhaps talk through how their design developed and where it passed and where it failed.
Well, what I wanted to ask you was, Mrs. Gibbs, it's Mrs. Gibbs, is it, tells us there was this call on this day, and the same day you email saying, let's work with, for example, Dyson. Did anyone suggest Dyson to you? Anyone political suggest Dyson to you?
No, but they're an obvious company who move air at speed. So they were separate, but I think they're a famous UK industrialist. JCB and Dyson, come to mind as famous UK entrepreneurs who are brilliant. So the Prime Minister didn't share his thoughts with me, so I think this is a separate,
not at that stage.
Separate discussion, yeah.
Moving on a week, the 20th of March. By the 20th of March, is this right? Dyson clearly undertaken some design work, which had been looked at by the Ventilator Challenge. Can we have a look, please, at yes, INQ 000233775. Can we see here? Just zone out for 1 minute, please, Lawrence. Can you see the top of this? This is a meeting readout of the daily procurement meeting of the 20th of March. It might be obvious.
Yeah.
The daily procurement meeting was?
So this is part of the confusion with the MIGs that you would have heard about. So initially, all procurement was supposed to be running through the Cabinet Office, but this meeting, I think, changed its name pretty quickly to focus just on ventilators and the other things that we were left with. So that you shouldn't read into that we were buying everything, but you can see from here that was the initial purpose or intent at this particular time. And you can see that from the attendees, Melinda Johnson from DH, Steve Oldfield from DH.
Yeah. And crucially, for the purpose of these questions, you were there. Could we focus in, Lawrence, please, on the section titled Ventilator Update? Gareth, that's you, presumably, is it? Yeah. Updated on the ventilator situation. Looking a few lines down. As of today, Gareth is the most optimistic he's been all week. Matt Hancock, that's the Health Secretary, isn't it, said that James Dyson had been in touch complaining about speed. His design had not been one of the better reviewed products. So someone's looked at, do I read this correctly? Someone's looked at the Dyson prototype or model or proposal and
yes,
at this very early stage, it's not received favourable feedback.
Another example of ministers and speed. Yes, the TDA had looked at an initial schematic, and I don't know if you've got that in your system, it's quite a detailed point, but the initial design from Dyson had some generated some big concerns.
Mr. Rhys-Williams, can I hesitant to interrupt. Can I come to that point in a moment, please? Yeah, I'm going to take it in stages, if I may. Just looking at the action point, make sure Dyson gets clear feedback on what they need to do to advance their ventilator design.
That's the point I was making, that this was an iterative process. So that would have been from the MHRA or from Dr.
Right.
Tom about what the design did need to do and what was not going to be appropriate.
Right, okay.
But that feedback was going back to everyone.
That was my next question. So that's not specific, is it? You've not singled them out saying, make sure they get feedback on how to improve their design.
We're working with everybody 24 hours a day on helping them with things that didn't work and sharing things that did work.
That was a wider point. Okay. Same afternoon, can we look, please, at I&Q 4848399? This is...
Yeah,
you may have anticipated. This is some of Dominic Cummings' WhatsApps to a group involving, seemingly, the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary, him, and some others. Can you see this message here? This is a message the afternoon of the 20th, so same day as the daily procurement meeting we were just looking at. Boris Johnson messages this: Dyson freaking action this day. A couple of minutes later, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, says, I have also received the same. I will talk to Dyson and Michael, I assume that to be Michael Gove, and sort it. At the heart of this problem is Cabinet Office trying to do things like buy ventilators that are core DHSC responsibility. It's why I was clear this morning that we need to take responsibility for these things here, with Michael Gove, checking progress, not have people falling over each other. Despite that, the ventilator project is going well. We will fix. A few questions, they might be obvious. Dyson freaking action this day from Boris Johnson. Did that type of message, or indeed that specific message, reach you?
No, and I only saw these, as a result of the inquiries. This document was released to me as part of the inquiry in the last month or so. I think what you see in that middle paragraph with the 3 lines in it is what I talked about earlier, with which minister was responsible for what at what stage. And perhaps there's a misunderstanding going on here, because always DH was buying the ventilators, but DH hadn't set up a design and make team, whatever, and that had been thrown to me. So I think maybe there's a couple of different strands in that middle paragraph.
Assertion, if I may say so.
Sorry?
Looks rather an ungrateful assertion by Mr. Hancock.
Yes, if I may say. The Dyson-specific point is this. The Prime Minister's texting his Health Secretary saying this one particular manufacturer is, quote, freaking, take action this day. Dyson-specific, did that pressure at this point reach you and your procurement colleagues?
No, there's one further down in this page, which I didn't know about at the time, but the first time that we had pressure on, related to Dyson was on the 25th.
Yes.
And with apart from everyone was all the teams were constantly chasing for updates.
Thank you.
But that was, much the same for each of them.
We're coming to the 25th shortly, and I know you've seen that message. That was the Dyson-specific question. Broader question, were, in your view, people falling over each other? Were there issues with how this was organised or set up? That's the Health Secretary's view, but I'm asking for your sort of reflection, your comment on it.
You may have covered this in an earlier module, milady, but I sent a note to Cabinet Office, or one of the Cabinet Office delivery team members, asking if we could have a little bit crisper clarity about which ministers were doing what, because on a couple of days, I remember there's a note, I think, from me to Manzoni. It took me until 1:30 in the afternoon before I could get back onto the ventilator or whatever I was actually supposed to be doing, because I'd spent all the other time in different ministerial update groups. And so I would read that problem into the falling over each other comment. But I did have to ask Mr. Hancock.
All right, well, sticking with Matt Hancock, the diary entry, you'll be aware of his pandemic diaries, I'm sure.
Only recently. I mean, you sent me some.
I did.
extras.
Yes, one extract from the 25th. You've mentioned the 25th. So around this time, this is what Mr. Hancock writes. James Dyson, the vacuum manufacturer, has been contacting numerous people in high places to ensure he has a prominent role. This is referring to the procurement of ventilators. He's continually on the phone, including to Boris, pushing to take part. We've moved on now to the 25th. Were you beginning to feel that kind of pressure?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Can we look, please, at another...
But there was a certain amount of press, and
yes.
I don't... So, I was reading that press, and, there we are. That's a pity. Dyson have published, everyone else has said they wouldn't, but, there we are.
Right. We can see, can't we, what's suggested is contact, continually on the phone to people in high places, Boris, the health secretary, others. You weren't aware of that?
That didn't get told to me, directly, but it's entirely likely. And I think it did come up in some of the press articles.
All right. Well, can I look at another WhatsApp message? I think you referred us to this one, in fact, and I'm referring you back to it. This is, thank you, yes, INQ 4848399, page 14. 7:53 in the morning, a message to the same group. Dyson has a ventilator ready to go. We can have 3,000 a week in 3 weeks made in the UK. It's safe, effective, and loses less oxygen. Rhys Williams has blocked it under the misapprehension that oxygen passes through the motor. That is total bollocks. I don't know if that counts as Anglo-Saxon. As far as I can see, we haven't actually ordered a single UK-produced ventilator. We are at risk of fiddling whilst Rome burns. I've spoke to Matt, that's, I assume, Hancock, and James Bethel, Lord Bethel, about it, and I've escalated the issue to everyone I can think of. When you see Matt this AM, you need to ask about Dyson ventilator and what is blocking it. Sorry, but I'm on a mission. Dyson knows what he's doing and won't risk his global brand reputation delivering dodgy ventilators. You can see what the Prime Minister thought of your apparent blocking of this design. Were you blocking this design?
It's a lot to unpick in that short set of bullets.
Well, then...
what this came from, and I believe the inquiry's got it, there was an email from Lord Feldman which went to the Prime Minister, to Lord Agnew, thence to me in pretty rapid succession. I could give you the INQ number if that's helpful, but within that there was a schematic my lady, just a drawing of a wire diagram of how the Dyson machine was going to work. And yes, it is true that the oxygen did not go through the fan. So the MHRA and the clinicians were very clear, I'm sure Ramani will talk to this, crystal clear, that you can't put air that gets into a patient, because it's bypassing their lungs, through a mechanical object, even as good a fan as the Dyson fan. Because if bits come off it, oil, bits of fan, material, they get injected at high speed directly into your lungs, and this is completely unacceptable. So it is true that on the schematic that came with the email that probably generated this text, WhatsApp, the oxygen doesn't go through the fan, but the air does. And they are then mixed. So at the time that this was written, the Dyson design was not going to pass the MHRA's standards.
Yes.
And you'd hear from them about that, no question, but that's my clear understanding at the time.
Right, well,
now, that's not to say that they couldn't fix it, as they eventually did, but
yes.
So whether Dyson, in the form of Sir James, understood that level of detail with his product design, I can't speak to. Whether his team had told him that, I can't speak to. The Prime Minister clearly believed that there was a product ready to go. In my humble opinion, having looked at it and having heard what the MHRA said, I didn't think that machine in its current state. So I wasn't blocking it. I was trying to encourage them to solve this and a number of other problems with the design at that stage.
Sorry, says the Prime Minister, I'm on a mission. Dyson knows what he's doing. Were you feeling that kind of pressure at this stage?
No.
All right.
But
you say...
The Prime Minister couldn't possibly have taken the time to understand that, to open that schematic, let alone, I suspect, understand it. It seems harsh to say, but he was just, I suspect he was just going with what he'd been told by Dyson. Now, had that been true, big caveat, then to be able to make 3,000 a week in 3 weeks, bear in mind we'd only been going by then less than a fortnight, so 3,000 in 5 weeks would have been beyond unbelievably brilliant. So I think there's context here. This obviously, the 25th, I believe, was only 2 days after lockdown. The first lockdown started. So basically, the country was still in complete panic. So I can see why some of the language here is quite emotive.
You say, same day, 25th of March, we've got this message. The same day, you say that there is, quotes, I don't know if this is civil service code, perhaps you can help us, a robust discussion about placing an order with Dyson in advance of clinical approval being secured. That's the same day.
There were several meetings that day on the subject of the TDA, and it was, the civil service code is it was a blunt meeting, yes.
Yes. After which, that afternoon, you send this email. Can we look, please, at INQ 30s 496699. This is an email from you to the Chief Executive of the Civil Service and Permanent Secretary of the Cabinet Office, Sir John Manzoni, CDL, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, just pausing there, the most senior minister in the Cabinet Office, have I got that right?
Yes.
CDL, that's Michael Gove, isn't it?
Yes.
Capitals you've written to Sir John Manzoni, insistent we place an order with Dyson, contingent on passing clinical and passing HMRA approvals. They're working at full speed already, but if that's what CDL wants, ...
So ministers can direct civil servants to do things, and that has to be written down, and it's very clear that when a direction is happening. And in the meeting, there were several meetings in the day, and I think this was after the second or the third meeting. I think there were 5. I or others, I can't remember, I think it was me, but it could have been someone else. I suspect Mr. Gove came into that meeting having seen that text and believing that the product was ready to go. I believed very differently. I felt that a better option rather than the minister directing me to place that order was to suggest or agree that we place an order contingent on it passing, because what I was really trying to protect was an order being placed which turned everyone else in the ventilator challenge off, because they would go, okay, well, if there's 10,000 going to Dyson, we may as well pack up, which would not have been what we wanted. But also, it was vital that the MHRA, still controlled the approval and not approval. And if
Yes.
I'd been told to place an order non-contingently, then my worry was that might have led to poor product.
Yes,
making it into the
so
market.
Gareth, we'll come to those step by step. But at this stage, anyway, this is 1302, we can see from the email. CDL, insistent we place an order. It's a contingent order. But as you say, if that's what CDL wants, ... you've got concerns, haven't you, at this stage?
Well, there's 2 parts to that sentence. And there were several emails between me and Manzoni. So I couldn't get hold of John in the meeting where this discussion happened. Neither could I get hold of Graham Tunbridge, who I believe you are hearing from, who was the MHRA rep's boss. Neither could I get hold of June, who was chief executive of the MHRA. Hence the idea of a contingent order. I think the second part of that was a complaint. We're not working fast enough. We're not producing. We're not testing things fast enough. There must be no bottlenecks in the process, which I would agree with. I don't believe there were bottlenecks in the process. We had not, at this stage, had a product to test from more or less anybody.
So Gareth,
and so
we're coming
that's
to that
I'm commenting there on the full speed part. Everyone was already working 24/7.
We'll see that evolve through the next email. Can we look, please? This is a few minutes later. INQ 000, please, Lawrence, 533247. This is an email from Richard Hornby. We can see his signature there, Chief Financial Officer of the Cabinet Office, to colleagues. So this is a few minutes later. Please accept this as authorisation to raise a purchase order for £100,000 in favour of Dyson prototype ventilators. Gareth Rhys-Williams has been instructed by the CDL, to proceed at pace. Description and conditions will come from Gareth and Dan. Thanks, and happy to discuss. Yesterday you told us two things. A minister saying, buy this from this person, and or saying, buy this quicker, do this quicker, would be wrong. This is both. Instructed by CDL to fulfil this contract and to proceed it at pace.
That might be why Rich wrote it. Rich was the finance director, so the procurement people in the Cabinet Office that I discussed yesterday worked for Rich. So they were the only people who could raise a purchase order. I wasn't able to do that.
Yes.
So
It's more your comment on the fact that are you normally instructed to proceed at pace on a particular contract, buy this and do it quickly?
no, but what we achieved by having the contingent point is that we kept the underpinning that product that had not been passed by the MHRA was still not going to be bought, and that is the key point which the CDL agreed to.
That afternoon, I think you were in touch quite a lot, weren't you, with Professor Muna Singha, the clinical care director, who's the senior clinician on the design authority, with concerns about some of the risks as you saw them with the Dyson design. You've talked about the air mix. One email you sent to her simply said, did you hear the bit about not having the alarms?
Okay, so that was a meeting where Sir James Dyson was asked to come along by CDL. I think that was about 12 o'clock-ish or something of that nature, 12:20. No, 3 o'clock. There were lots of meetings all that day.
Yes.
And Sir James, or one of Sir James's team, said that the prototype that they were apparently going to send us that day, which was the subject of have we got enough capacity to test it, and that was a concern that CDL had. Yes, we did, but that was his concern. Also was missing alarms. So these things, my lady, are used over a period of days, and they need to have alarms if someone pulls the power plug out, if they run out of oxygen, a whole range of alarms. These are not difficult to do, but the machine must have them. And when we were describing the status of the Dyson product in that meeting, and there's a picture which is quite instructive. I don't know if you
I do, but yes.
The fact that it didn't have alarms rather goes against the idea that this machine was ready to go. It's not to say that it wouldn't manage to achieve the alarm design in a 3-week period, but it was non-proven at that stage, in my opinion.
That same day, a letter was in fact sent to Dyson, signed by you, placing, as you say, a contingent order for 10,000 ventilators on terms that Dyson gained clinical and MRHA approvals. Is that correct?
That was the
Could you pause
important
there
point.
for a second, Mr. Just winding back a little, you've got the Prime Minister being very waspish and accepting what he'd been told by Sir James Dyson. Maybe Sir James Dyson had been told that by his team. I'm not being whatever. You then got Michael Gove instructing you to agree a contract with Dyson. They've obviously just accepted the message that has come from the Dyson company. Did anybody come to you and ask you what you said about what was happening before you were given the instructions to proceed with this contract? Did they check with you whether they were being given the right information?
Yes, so in the series of meetings we had, I said, I think I made the point, we haven't yet seen a prototype, so it may be ready to go. But from the drawings that were sent in to the Prime Minister, which then found their way to me, and they were very similar to ones that I'd got by a variety of other routes. I don't know if we're going to show it, that there's a picture of their prototype at that stage, which lady used what was called a breadboard. So imagine a breadboard, and you just put the bits, the components on it, and nail them down with pins, and you wire them up. You know, it was not. I think Fraser, the PA guy, describes it as, you know, works like, looks like, is like. This is a breadboard is very early stage.
And so my question really, I'm sorry to
And I
think about-
made that point, and I said the pictures I've seen are only of breadboard. I would be amazed if these are ready to go.
How did you give them that advice before you were given instructions to proceed with the contract?
Well, that's what I think led to the agreement that it should be contingent, and that, which is what bridged the gap between ministers perhaps being told, believing that it was ready to go by an eminent industrialist, and me saying, I don't think so. And there are other notes where I say, if it was indeed true, and I put this in my evidence to you, my lady, if it was indeed true that it was ready to go, we absolutely had to buy. But it would have been better, in my opinion, at the time to have let it run through the process and do as we did with everyone else. But I don't think it made any material difference, because he didn't actually get an order, because, as we may come to,
Yes.
the product didn't eventually pass those tests.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I just want to rewind again slightly. The email to which Mr. Stoke took you a moment ago said that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Mr. Gove, had directed you to enter into this contract. No reference to contingency. So my question really is, at what stage did you were you able to give the advice that this wasn't a project that was ready to go? And so in other words, were you being directed to enter into the contract before you'd had an opportunity to give the advice? That
was the next sentence that would have happened, which is why I came up with the contingent part. But I think all the emails, the one from Rich that you just put up, that had the contingent point in it. My note to Manzoni had the contingent point in it. So I think we'd got past that stage by lunchtime on that day. So we weren't going to. It would have been entirely wrong to have had a non-contingent order in that case.
Right, so you think you had given advice because that's why you wanted contingency in there. Yet nonetheless, you were directed to enter into the contract.
Yes, it would have been better and to have let the process wind forwards. But I can quite understand if the politicians believed that this was, game-changing 2 days into lockdown, why they wanted, to make sure we were making progress.
But Sir Gareth, even your contingency came under significant pressure, didn't it? Can we just look at, please, at INQ 304971116? This is the same evening, right? So we've got the instructed to proceed at pace email at 1 o'clock, 1:10. This is the same evening. Can we see at the top there? It's Wednesday, the 25th of March, 1838, from Mr. Gove's private secretary. Many thanks for the call with Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster and Lord Agnew. He was the procurement minister, wasn't he?
Yeah.
In the department. Please find actions below. First bullet point, Sir James Dyson and team to start buying the components needed to make their product. 1, 2, 3, 4. Fifth bullet point, and this is the one I want to ask you about. MHRA and Gareth Rhys-Williams to ensure that by the end of Friday, the Dyson product has been tested and approved by the MHRA. A small number of products have been provided to hospitals for human testing, and the final product has started to be manufactured. Gareth Rhys-Williams to immediately escalate any blockages to ministers. If I may, Sir Gareth, you managed to negotiate in a contingency, but the readout here says, fine, but by the end of Friday, tested, approved, batches in hospitals for human testing and manufacture beginning. Dare I suggest it's completely unrealistic, isn't it?
Yes.
Not very long after.
Sorry, and perhaps to explain, having seen the breadboard, having seen the schematic, and what is also important to realise, my lady, you have to manufacture these with a quality management system. We talked about the other manufacturers. The way Dyson works is not in that industry, and so to set all that up in a couple of days was just never going to happen, in my opinion.
Yes.
But I didn't read into that you must approve, that the MHRA must approve it where they wouldn't if they weren't otherwise going to approve it. I read that more as there must be no blockages, get every tester you can to quickly assess this product, and if it indeed it passes, get it done by Friday, underlined, rather than allow any blockages or delays to creep into the process. So I think it was accepted that the thing needed to pass the relevant tests.
Well, it simply says by the end of Friday, to ensure that by the end of Friday the Dyson product had been tested and approved. In any event, a couple of hours after that, INQ, please, Lawrence, 000 534490. You emailed Sir John Manzoni again in these terms. Suggestions what to do. I do feel that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, that's Mr. Gove, is being unreasonable. Even if he was correct that we delayed anything, which I don't believe he is at all, his tone is ... regrettable. But see below, it would appear that the Dyson sample is not yet ready to be shipped by them. MHRA could have been testing something else this evening. In the meanwhile, we are, of course, getting, more test rigs for them, so that is no bottleneck. Yes?
Yep.
I may not need to ask you any more about that, but what we can see when we trace it through is that the next day Sir John Manzoni felt it necessary to email the MHRA directly, didn't he? He intervened personally.
Well, John sent a note round to everyone. By that time, I had talked to Graham Tunbridge and others to make sure that we were standing this up as fast as we possibly could, because I thought we were, but it's always a fair thing to assume that you've overlooked something. And so I wanted to convince myself that there weren't any blockages that were being, as was being alleged by a variety of people. And, sorry.
The following day, after Sir John Manzoni's intervention, INQ, please, Lawrence, 304971116. This is a response from Graham Tunbridge, who you've mentioned, Director of Devices at the MHRA, referring to Mr. Manzoni's intervention. He says as follows: the MHRA's Clinical Director of Devices, Duncan Macpherson, joined a call yesterday with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, CDL, James Dyson, John Manzoni and others in the Cabinet Office to discuss Dyson's proposal for a ventilator. The Dyson proposal involves a totally new design, built in manufacturing facilities normally used for standard industrial products or potentially decommissioned from producing electric cars. For this reason, it wasn't intended to be pursued because of the risk involved and the additional work that will be required to ensure that the ventilator produced at the end was meeting appropriate standards. James Dyson expressed his concerns with ministers, and you will also have seen that he's been speaking to the press this morning. The readout from CDL's private office and response by John Manzoni are below. In short, you will see that CDL was keen to press forward with Dyson's proposal to a timescale that is totally unrealistic, based in part on promises made by Dyson that are already not being fulfilled. In addition, however, CDL, Mr. Gove, did not appreciate the level of risk involved in the manufacture and use of ventilators and wanted to circumvent the expedited regulatory process that has been put in place. And it goes on there. In his witness statement to the inquiry, Sir Gareth, Sir John Manzoni says this at his paragraph 62. I recall I was concerned that by virtue of the meeting being called by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, indirect pressure was being placed on the MHRA to approve the supplier's design at the stage of selecting suppliers to progress in the ventilator challenge. I felt I had to and did intervene in this meeting to ensure that the MRHA approval system, as the regulatory system, was properly applied and to protect the integrity of the process.
That's exactly the same point about why I was insistent on an audit contingent on passing the standards, and it was helpful of John to row in behind that.
Yes. On one view, it might be said this was an example of the regulatory system you had been trying to ensure the integrity of working, wasn't it? The MHRA stood on its process, and not very long after this, MedTech, Professor Clutton-Brock, did send a report saying that the Dyson model was did not meet the essential safety requirements.
Yes, and I started sending those test reports because there were multiple test reports for all the machines, but for Dyson's I sent them directly to Sir James so that he could see firsthand what the concerns were of the clinician fraternity, so that there would be hopefully less confusion or less misunderstanding about what was and was not likely to be acceptable.
The story does continue somewhat into April, though, doesn't it? Could we just look, please, briefly at INQ 000512992? This is an email chain between you and Lord Agnew, the Procurement Minister.
Yep.
Towards the bottom of the, I think over the page, in fact, one of the things you write to Lord Agnew is a list of likely candidates to be struck off. As in ventilator candidates in the ventilator challenge who are going to be whittled out through that process. Yep. And you say one of them is Dyson.
Yep.
And if we go back up to the top and look at Lord Agnew's point C, please, his response to you is as follows. We're going to have to handle Dyson very carefully. I accept that contractually we can walk away as he hasn't delivered by the due date. I also accept that we have an indemnity battle ahead. But just killing off his design, assuming it gets through the MHRA, won't be an option. I suspect we'll have to buy a few machines, get them into hospitals so that he can then market internationally, being able to say they're being used in UK hospitals. Just pausing there, what was your reaction to the receipt of this email, to that suggestion?
Well, it's worth explaining a little bit of the background before this note. So Dyson, the Dyson team took away the advice from MD Tech about the fan and the airflow, and they fixed it. And they fixed a lot of the alarms. That was all good. On the other hand, what also happened was what we talked about before, where the clinicians realised this problem with the mucus on the lungs and a couple of other things, which then even the improved Dyson machine was not looking like it's the underlying structure, the underlying way it worked, said to the clinicians, and Dr. Tom particularly, they're not going to be able to bridge that gap. And that's why the TDA was ranking. So every TDA we ranked the machines to see, where we were, in the way we discussed. I felt at that time, when we still hadn't, so the contractual point, the contingency, milady, was that they were supposed to be in production by the 13th of April. That's 13th of April. So they weren't going to hit it by then. So the order would have fallen away. Now, the point here about the buy a few machines, assuming it gets through the MHRA.
Well, yes.
So
that he can then market internationally, being able to say they're being used in UK hospitals.
Yeah, well, so the MHRA wasn't going to approve. What we managed to achieve here was making sure that the MHRA held the pen. And they were very clear, as I explained at the beginning of this piece, milady, that the MHRA was only allowed to give emergency license for the volume that we needed for our emergency purposes. And by this stage, it was already looking like, we hadn't got them, but it was looking like the other ones we had would be sufficient to cover what we needed. And therefore, I was pretty confident that the MHRA was going to stop issuing licenses. And therefore, this is a non-point.
Lord Agnew continues, I also probably have more faith than you that he, James Dyson, will somehow be able to he will be somehow able to upgrade his machines to get higher up your graph of functionality. We should not underestimate his enormous design firepower, even if new to the medical devices industry. I fully accept that you're likely to disagree with me, but we both need to accept it will be a bigger decision than we can both make. Remember, he got a personal call from the PM. This can't be ignored. What did you understand to be the significance of a personal call from the PM? What did that mean to you?
Well, you'd have to. The PM, we haven't talked about it, but the PM went off on a number of visits for lateral flow suppliers. So, to be honest, I would shrug on that. It either passed the standards or it didn't pass the standards, and I was not part of the standard setting or evaluation team. That's not my skill set. So this was all with the MHRA. What we had got by this stage was complete acceptance by everybody that the MHRA held the pen. And on the other hand, if the MHRA decided to approve it, nothing to do with me, then if ministers wanted to pay for us to get a few machines in the way that Lord Agnew is talking about, then that would be a subject of ministerial direction. But we never got to that point because they never got the MHRA approval.
So that he can market them internationally, being able to say they're used in UK hospitals. That would be appropriate, would it?
Well, lots of people will trial something in the UK and then leverage off that to sell. And that's a matter for Dyson. But by this stage, they were not planning to make in the UK, but to make in Singapore, where they had a big manufacturing facility. And to my mind, that just underlined how unlikely it was that they would get permission from the MHRA, because the MHRA needed to inspect the facility and be confident that it had the quality management system that we discussed earlier in place. And of course, travelling to Singapore would have been more or less impossible during the pandemic. So this for me was in the realms of quite hypothetical. Not that they weren't trying very hard. So, Lord Agnew is absolutely right. Dyson are a brilliant company, brilliant designers. But in this case, we were trying to do what normal companies do in 5 or 7 years in a matter of weeks. So we shouldn't be, they did brilliantly to get this far, but they didn't have a product that made it far enough in the time.
Well, can you complete the story for us? What did become of Lord Agnew's suggestion that a few be purchased to use in UK hospitals so that Dyson could market them internationally, being able to say they were being used in UK hospitals?
It didn't happen because the MHRA didn't approve any, and maybe sensing that or for whatever reason, there's a series of emails from Dyson where they folded the project, and there's a whole discussion on licensing where I was looking to recoup taxpayers' money if they were going to do that, if the MHRA gave them permission. But in the event, that all became academic.
You say in your fourth statement, this sentence, industry wishes to sell products or services to government, and part of our job is to ensure that if government wants those products or services, a process is used to assess the potential contract and to keep people with conflicts out of the decision chain.
So
tracing through what Mr. Webster describes as the political sensitivity in relation to Dyson, we've seen the involvement of the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary, the most senior minister in your department, that's Mr. Gove, the Procurement Minister, Lord Agnew, all trying to seemingly place this regulatory system under pressure. In terms of your maxim, as it were, there, industry wants to sell us stuff, we try and keep people with conflicts out. Can you be assured that happened in this case?
Yes, because the decision maker in this case was the MHRA, my lady, and they were crystal about it, and Dr. Tom, who ran the testing group, and Ramani and her group of clinicians. So I think I wrote that paragraph trying to distinguish, to answer a different question from the inquiry on conflicts of interest, where I think I was saying that suppliers don't have a conflict of interest, they have an interest. So we shouldn't be surprised that suppliers pester everybody to get an order. That's what suppliers do. Of course, we should anticipate that, but that doesn't mean they get an order. They have to prove that they deserve the order, and that's the job of the procurement team. So I don't think... I don't think Dyson had a conflict of interest. He had an interest, obviously.
You're aware that Professor Sanchez-Graels has offered a comment on this?
On the procurement methodology, yes.
Not just the procurement methodology, but specifically, can I look, please, Lawrence, at INQ 000539153. This is part of Professor Sanchez-Graels' report, the last paragraph there. Favouring Dyson, he says, due to the political pressure ministers were under, would have been clearly problematic And in my view, beyond being objectionable, it would have raised serious questions as to its legality. It would also have raised questions on the origin of the political pressure, given that the decision was made, as we've seen, by the Secretary of State. In other words, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Do you have a view on that?
Well, yes, that's why we ended up down the route that we did. But in the end, at the end of the day, Dyson got no money from the public purse and didn't make any product. So had that happened, had that pressure translated into a otherwise unapprovable product that would not have been approved, being approved and then marketed, then absolutely everything that Professor Sanchez-Grail said, I'd absolutely agree with.
Would have raised serious questions as to its legality.
Had it happened,
Indeed.
the evidence,
Yeah.
its witnesses, it didn't. Well, we know it didn't.
Yeah.
Didn't get the contract. I think we pursued this enough.
And the Professor Sanchez-Grails also talks about the procurement method generally in respect of the ventilator challenge. He says in his summary box, page 20, that was, I think, came up on the screen yesterday, in very short order, he's not convinced it was the best or the proper procurement process to have used. Do you have any comment on that? I wanted to offer you an opportunity to give us your view on.
Yeah, I disagree with him completely, with respect. 3,000 people a week after 2 weeks. The minimum time, assuming everyone processes the papers and the offers instantaneously, which is not the case, with a complex procedure like competitive dialogue or competitive procedure with negotiation. The average for those, my lady, in the last year or two, I asked colleagues to do that, is 415 days to run the process. We had the first product from Penline, a new product, in less time than the minimum legal requirement to run those complex procedures. Now, his argument that, well, normally designing one of these things takes 5 to 7 years, therefore in that you would have had plenty of time to run a procurement procedure. Well, yes, but the object of the exercise was to get product in a fortnight, and we got product in a month, which, no credit to me, but to the thousands of people who worked on this, it was just beyond astonishing. But to force us to use a procedure that would inevitably have meant at that time 6,000 people would have died because we'd not used the emergency regulations, I think it'd be very hard to justify that. I think this is exactly what the emergency procedure was for.
So, Sir Gareth, looking at what we've gone through in this brief time, how you established the challenge, what the challenge achieved in such a short period of time, the pressure, the stresses and strains it came under, and some of the comment and criticism that's been made of it, drawing that together as briefly as possible, what would you say were the key lessons in the event of a pandemic in the future that requires the scaling up of any type of complex medical technology? Let's put ventilators aside, whatever it be. Give us your key lessons or recommendations for the future.
Well, the key one is start with enough product, whether that's PPE or ventilators or some other machine. And we very nearly ran out of, and Ramani talks about it, syringe drivers, which are what we use to inject. So has the NHS got however many they feel they need, and a bit, for in a pandemic store ready to go at the start? And this whole problem was generated, I think in February, the NHS thought they needed 60,000. And so in a way that wasted a month. So the second lesson would be, as soon as a gap appears, tell people like me who are mad enough to try to do what we did do, because that would have given us an extra month and maybe we would have got better product, maybe. But this method, this rapid down select, is what was then very useful for the vaccine program, which used, and I think the point was, Treasury, the civil service machine, normally you don't procure like this. You do a test, you then try and scale up one, and blah, blah, blah. Here we were this pyramid effect that you talked about,
really worked, and that's exactly what Kate Bingham and the team were able to do with vaccines, what we're doing at the moment with small modular, my ex-colleagues are doing with small modular reactors. This is an unusual way of thinking for government. It's a much more industrial, commercial way of thinking about product. And there's been a number of criticisms about the amount that was wasted on the products that didn't work. Fair enough. We'd have loved to have known which ones were going to work, but we had no real way of knowing. The net of it was that the machines we delivered, even allowing for the R&D cost, were less or cheaper than the machines bought on the market. This was an astonishing success, and I think the lesson is we can do this if we try, but obviously we'd rather not be in the position that we started with.
Thank you, Milady.
Thank you. I think there's one question from Mr. Thomas, who's hiding behind that pillar. He's not going to be hiding for long.
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed, and I see you as well.
Good morning. I represent FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. Just a little context behind my question. I'm sure we can agree that the procurement of personal protective equipment, PPE, during the pandemic was not just a logistical challenge, but also a critical test of our commitment to equity and inclusivity in healthcare practices. And I'm sure you're aware that it's well documented that ethnic minority healthcare workers faced disproportionately higher risks during the pandemic, particularly due to inadequacies in PPE. We've had a lot of evidence in relation to this. So my question to you is this. Given your role and responsibility, it's essential for an organisation like FEMHO to understand how the Cabinet Office navigated these complexities, particularly adhering to the public sector equality duty under the Equality Act 2010. So, as such, given this unprecedented global health crisis, number one, firstly, could you please explain how the Cabinet Office ensured that its legal obligations under the public sector equality duty were met during the procurement activities for PPE? That's the first question.
Shall I answer that first, or would you?
Yes, please.
So the Cabinet Office, per se, Milady, Mr. Thomas, weren't buying things directly. The staff mainly from the complex transactions team, but other people from Cabinet Office that we posted into the PPE buying teams were working under the instruction of the Department of Health. So they had no role to play in what they were asked to buy. They were told what was required, and they bought it. So the Cabinet Office didn't really play a role in the way that the question's framed, I think. And the same for ventilators. We built what the clinicians asked us to build.
All right. So let me come on to my last question. I think you may have answered it, but I'll put the question to you just in case. So, was there any specific measures implemented to align the procurement processes with the requirement of the public sector equality duty to ensure that the needs, particularly of ethnic minority healthcare workers, were adequately addressed?
I mean, the short answer is no, for the reason I gave, that the demand that we were asked to buy came from the Department of Health. So I would not, and I don't think any of my team would have known which products were useful for which minority group or majority group. So we just took what we were told to buy by the PHE, or as it turned into UXA, and bought that. So
I understand that, but you accept that the public sector equality duty did apply to the Cabinet Office?
Well, the contracts were placed by DH. So I'm not sure that I do with respect, because the people that were employed by the Cabinet Office were working, under DH management and to acquire materials, PPE, that DH required. So we had to assume the number, the types that they asked for was a matter for their consideration. None of the buyers would have been remotely qualified you raised very real concerns. I'm not diminishing the concerns at all. And, I think later, or as the pandemic progressed, we all realised that there were fit issues with this product. But that specification of the product was outside of what the Cabinet Office people were able to.
I think we can end it here. We can agree on this. We can agree that, if I've understood your evidence correctly, there was no specific oversight by the Cabinet Office of those who were buying or putting in the orders for the equipment. Would that be fair?
I think what you said was that essentially, yes, of course, the public sector equality duty applies to all government departments, but essentially it was the DHSC upon whom it would have been particularly relevant in this instance.
I shall pick that up later.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
That completes our questions for you. You've been very modest about your role in the ventilator challenge, but as you say, it was an extraordinary achievement, and I think a huge amount of the credit plainly goes to you. So whatever other people say about procurement generally, as far as the ventilator challenge is concerned, on behalf of those who needed them, may I thank you for all that you and your colleagues did.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for all the help that you've given to the inquiry.
Thank you.
I shall return at 2:00.